close your eyes and let your thoughts dissolve into the dark. Not the frightening kind of dark, but the kind that quiets everything, the kind that feels like floating. Tonight, in this stillness, we drift into the slow unraveling of a truth not shaped by evidence, but by something far more subtle and far more deceptive. You've heard it before. A phrase, a statement. Maybe it sounded harmless. Maybe it wasn't even worth noticing. It could have been whispered through a screen, printed in passing, or murmured by someone who never questioned it themselves. The first time it reached you, it slid off your awareness like rain against a window. But then it returned, again and again and again. The human mind, intricate and luminous, is not immune to echoes. In fact, it is shaped by them. What begins as a faint repetition begins to wear grooves into your thoughts. Repetition is not just an annoyance, it is a sculptor, a slow, methodical artist of belief. One repetition is forgettable, two perhaps familiar. But by the 10th or the 50th, the phrase no longer feels external. It begins to sound like your own thinking. And this is where the illusion takes root, not in argument, not in logic, but in repetition. The illusionary truth effect. That's what they call it. You wouldn't think your brain would be so easy to fool. After all, it's the seat of your reason, your judgment, your entire sense of reality. But this effect slips beneath reason. It doesn't demand analysis. It never forces confrontation. It merely exists, quietly, repeatedly, until the familiarity it creates starts to feel like truth. This is not weakness. This is wiring. Your brain was designed for survival, not certainty. For most of human history, efficiency mattered more than accuracy. If a pattern appeared over and over, footsteps in the same grass, the rustle in a certain bush, the echo of a particular sound, your ancestors learned to trust that pattern. Their survival depended on it. So, the brain evolved to treat the familiar as safe and the safe as true. But now, we no longer face lions in tall grass. We face headlines, tweets, viral sound bites, repeated claims, constant messages flowing through screens and speakers with such frequency that we no longer register their arrival. They simply accumulate, and what accumulates in silence begins to feel like foundation. Have you ever caught yourself defending something you've never actually examined? An opinion that you've never questioned, but you carry it like a stone in your pocket. That's the illusionary truth, quietly nesting within. It doesn't scream, it doesn't demand. It lulls. And it is here, in this lull, that we begin to confuse recognition with reality. We think, I've heard this before, and that familiarity generates comfort. Comfort softens doubt. And what once required examination becomes a passive acceptance. But comfort and truth are not the same. Familiarity and fact are not bound together. This is the deception of repetition, not in its content, but in its rhythm, not in what it says, but in how often it says it. So tonight, in the quiet hour where thought drifts and defenses fade, ask yourself, what do I believe simply because I've heard it more than once? Which thoughts have become mine, not by discovery, but by exposure? Which parts of my worldview were never truly born of my questioning, but were planted, gently and often, by someone else's repetition? We do not need to blame ourselves for this. The illusionary truth effect is not a flaw in your intelligence. It is a shadow of being human. But when we become aware of it, when we begin to notice the echo, we create space. Space for reflection, space for pause, space for reawakening to the origin of our beliefs. And that space is sacred. Because truth, the real kind, is rarely loud. It does not scream over and over for attention. It does not flood your timeline or interrupt your scrolling. Truth waits. It waits in the quiet. It waits for the mind to stop chasing noise and begin listening again. So, as you breathe softer and let the world dissolve into darkness, allow this thought to sit with you. Not all that repeats is real. Not all that echoes is true. And not every thought in your mind was born from your own knowing. In this softness, in this stillness, let your mind rest not in what has been said 1,000 times, but in the calm awareness that you are capable of finding truth, even beneath the illusion. Beneath the layers of thought, memory, and imagination, your brain has been shaped by something ancient. A soft compulsion echoing through the ages, the search for patterns. Not just the obvious ones, but the hidden ones, the ones that whisper rather than speak. Patterns in stars, patterns in footsteps, patterns in words. The human brain, unlike any machine we've ever created, is not simply a tool for logic. It is a story seeker, a prediction engine, a painter of symmetry onto the chaotic canvas of life. From the moment you were born, your brain has been tirelessly detecting repetition, rhythm, and resemblance. The sound of your mother's voice, the flicker of light through the trees, the pulse of a heartbeat beneath a lullaby. These patterns soothed you, taught you, tethered you, and over time they built the scaffolding for everything you would later believe to be real. The patterns gave rise to meaning, meaning gave rise to belief. And belief, well, belief is the place where truth and illusion can shake hands in the dark. But let's take it slowly. Imagine you are standing in a forest, long before cities, before clocks, before language even had grammar. You hear a rustle in the bushes. Two thoughts flicker in your mind. 1. It's the wind. 2. It's a predator. Your ancestors, those who guessed wrong, were quickly removed from the story. Those who guessed predator, even when it was just the wind, survived. They passed on this cautious, pattern-sensitive brain, one that errs on the side of connection, one that sees something, even when there is nothing. This is where it began, this beautiful curse of ours. So now, thousands of years later, when we see a stranger smile just like an old friend, our mind makes a leap. When a song's chorus echoes a memory we buried years ago, the past returns not as fact, but as feeling. When the phone buzzes right after we think of someone, a coincidence becomes fate. We are constantly threading invisible strings between moments, stitching time together with meaning, whether it's truly there or not. And we do this because it feels safe, it feels right, it feels like truth. But what happens when the pattern we think we see isn't real? What happens when the comfort of recognition leads us astray? Here's where the illusion begins to grow roots. Your brain is so efficient at pattern recognition, so hungry for meaning, that it begins to find signals even in static. It doesn't like randomness, it doesn't trust uncertainty. So, when a random event occurs, when someone says something kind after a hard day, or you read the same word 3 times in one morning, your mind leans in, ready to assign significance. It's not lying to you. It's not being deceitful. It's trying to help you feel anchored in a world that often feels like open water. This tendency is not a flaw. It is not foolishness. It is humanity. Yet, because of it, we sometimes carry beliefs that were never meant to be truths. We confuse repeated coincidences with evidence. We misread familiarity as fact. If we hear something often enough and it follows a pattern we recognize, we begin to trust it, even if it's not true, even if, deep down, part of us wonders. And that is how the seeds of illusionary truth are planted, not in the loud thunder of lies, but in the soft drizzle of patterns that feel too familiar to question. Think of a nursery rhyme you learned as a child. The melody, the rhythm, the way the words seem to fall effortlessly into place. You may not remember where you learned it, but the pattern remains etched into your mind. The same is true for thoughts, ideas, even propaganda. Repeat them enough, wrap them in rhythm, echo them in voices we trust, and they become part of us. Not because we chose them, but because they felt familiar, safe, patterned. But here's something gentle to hold on to. Recognizing the illusion does not mean tearing down the beauty. Patterns have also guided us towards science, art, and love. They help us predict the sunrise and recognize a friend in a crowd. They let us dance to music, dream in verses, and find poetry in the waves. The same brain that builds illusion can also build empathy, wonder, truth. So tonight, as you fall deeper into sleep, allow your thoughts to slow. Let the patterns dissolve. Notice how your breath is both rhythm and release. In, outside, in, outside. A sacred loop that needs no story, no meaning, just presence. Trust that your brain, built for patterns, is not your enemy. It is simply trying to make sense of the noise. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between meaning and memory, we can see clearly. Not because the pattern was perfect, but because we chose to pause, to listen, and to wonder. That too is a pattern, a beautiful one. Let it cradle you now. Let it carry you into the next dream. The human mind is not a fortress. It is not walled in stone, nor defended by gates of logic or ramparts of certainty. Instead, it is a field, open, fertile, and ever vulnerable to seeds drifting in on unseen winds. Some seeds are truths, others are lies wrapped in familiarity. But the soil does not discriminate. It receives them both the same. Suggestions are small things. A passing phrase, a lingering glance, a repetition on a screen. They don't announce their arrival. They don't demand your attention. They settle quietly in the soft folds of memory, in the undisturbed corners of belief. At first they mean nothing, but over time they grow roots. Picture yourself walking through a forest where the trees whisper ideas. Some repeat what you've already heard. Others introduce questions you've never asked. You move through the hush of branches and begin to wonder, did I think that, or did I absorb it? Did I choose this belief, or was it whispered so gently that I mistook it for my own thought? This is the nature of suggestion. It bypasses resistance. It doesn't argue or convince. It slides beneath awareness and takes shape through exposure. Once is not enough, but 10 times, 20, 100, and it becomes part of the inner dialogue, a script rehearsed in silence. You may have experienced it without noticing, a tune you didn't like at first, but after hearing it in the background over and over again, you began to hum it, a slogan repeated until it lived in your tongue, a face shown so often it felt familiar, even trustworthy. That is the quiet power of suggestion, not in what it says, but in how often it's allowed to speak. In ancient times, suggestion was the art of the oracle and the priest, a symbol, a phrase, a gaze into fire or smoke. Today it comes through algorithms, advertisements, curated headlines, and influencers speaking with certainty. It comes through repetition disguised as relevance, through familiarity masquerading as truth. We like to believe we are immune, that our beliefs are our own, that we are the authors of our convictions. But this illusion is comforting more than it is accurate. The mind craves shortcuts. Familiarity feels like safety. Repeated exposure feels like credibility. And so, the more we hear something, the more our minds begin to treat it as real, regardless of its origin. The seeds of suggestion are watered by time, reinforced by emotion, and protected by memory. Once they grow tall enough, they cast shadows on everything else. They filter how we interpret the world, what we dismiss, what we notice, what we defend, what we fear. It is not always malicious. Often it is simply unnoticed. A parent's caution repeated in childhood becomes a fear in adulthood. A teacher's doubt becomes an internal voice of limitation. A society's standard becomes an invisible rule we never thought to challenge. Suggestions do not force, they shape. Consider the placebo effect. A sugar pill believed to be medicine produces real healing, not because of chemistry, but because of belief. The body responds to suggestion. Consider the nocebo, its shadow twin, a harmless substance producing real harm when fear is suggested. These are not illusions, they are measurable. The body, too, is shaped by thought, and so are relationships. One whispered doubt can grow into suspicion. A casual comment repeated can erode trust. Praise, too, can shape reality. A child told they are clever begins to seek out cleverness. A person told they are loved begins to notice proof of love all around them. Suggestion doesn't just reflect reality, it creates it. But it also deceives. A rumor repeated enough becomes memory. A claim repeated becomes common knowledge. The brain, in its hunger for simplicity, often prefers repeated lies to complex truths. The lie, when repeated, becomes smooth, familiar, comfortable, and the truth, when rare, feels sharp, strange, invasive. That is why the seeds of suggestion are so dangerous, not because they are planted, but because we do not see them as foreign. We think they grew there on their own. We think they've always been part of the landscape of our minds. To defend against suggestion is not to resist all ideas. It is to pause, to ask, where did this belief come from? Who planted it? Who watered it? And does it still deserve space within me? We will always be vulnerable to suggestion. That is part of being human, but we can learn to tend our mental gardens with care, to notice the seeds before they root, to choose which ones to nourish, and perhaps most importantly, to pull out what no longer belongs, gently, patiently, and without shame, because the mind, like a garden, can heal, even if it has been overrun, even if it has forgotten the light, even if some roots run deep. With awareness, the power of suggestion shifts. No longer an invader, but a tool. No longer a trap, but a choice. And so are relationships. One whispered doubt can grow into suspicion. A casual comment repeated can erode trust. Praise, too, can shape reality. A child told they are clever begins to seek out cleverness. A person told they are loved begins to notice proof of love all around them. Suggestion doesn't just reflect reality, it creates it, but it also deceives. A rumor repeated enough becomes memory. A claim repeated becomes common knowledge. The brain, in its hunger for simplicity, often prefers repeated lies to complex truths. The lie, when repeated, becomes smooth, familiar, comfortable, and the truth, when rare, feels sharp, strange, invasive. That is why the seeds of suggestion are so dangerous, not because they are planted, but because we do not see them as foreign. We think they grew there on their own. We think they've always been part of the landscape of our minds. To defend against suggestion is not to resist all ideas. It is to pause, to ask, where did this belief come from? Who planted it? Who watered it? And does it still deserve space within me? We will always be vulnerable to suggestion. That is part of being human. But we can learn to tend our mental gardens with care, to notice the seeds before they root, to choose which ones to nourish, and perhaps most importantly, to pull out what no longer belongs, gently, patiently, and without shame, because the mind, like a garden, can heal, even if it has been overrun, even if it has forgotten the light, even if some roots run deep. With awareness, the power of suggestion shifts. No longer an invader, but a tool. No longer a trap, but a choice. And so, in this quiet hour, you are invited to wander back through your thoughts, to notice what has been growing there, to hold each idea up to the moonlight and ask softly where it came from. Because behind every belief is a whisper, and behind every whisper a gardener. Let the noise fade, let the roots be visible, and in this stillness let the truth, not the loudest voice, but the most enduring, begin to emerge. There is a quiet architecture to your thoughts, a hidden chamber that resonates with the echoes of everything you've ever heard, felt, feared, and believed. This chamber is not made of stone or wood, but of neurons and meaning, soft walls that absorb your whispers and return them, distorted, reshaped, softened by time but never truly forgotten. When a thought enters your mind, it does not simply vanish after its moment. It leaves a trail, a ripple, a hum. It finds its way into this mental hallway, a corridor that stretches through memory, suggestion, emotion, and bias. And though you walk forward in life, the echoes behind you remain, faint, persistent, and strangely familiar. The mind, in its yearning for certainty, tends to favor repetition. Thoughts heard often begin to wear grooves, like footsteps on marble. A lie told once might be dismissed, but a lie repeated gently, rhythmically, perhaps even with a smile, this lie becomes music, and music is hard to resist. You remember what was said, not just by others, but by yourself. The mind is a brilliant mimic, a voice actor with no clear source. It replays things not because they are true, but because they were heard, because they were said often enough, because their shape fits neatly into the grooves already forming. And so, a falsehood said many times becomes familiar, and what is familiar begins to feel safe, and what feels safe begins to feel real. This is how echoes work. They don't come back as they left. They come back changed, warmed by memory, colored by emotion, muffled by distance, but still recognizable, enough that they slip past your guard, past the rational gatekeeper. And in that moment, they don't need to convince you all at once. They just need to stay, to linger. A suggestion becomes a sentence becomes a belief becomes a world view. Your inner hall is not empty. It's filled with murmurs, some comforting, some chilling. The voice of a parent or a teacher, a friend, a stranger, a commercial, a poem. Some you chose to remember, others were chosen for you, and you carry them. You carry them into dreams, into conversations, into silence. This is the paradox of thought. We believe we are thinking anew, but often we are only echoing. And the louder the echo, the more we confuse it for truth. The architecture of this mental hall is built over time. Every repeated word is a brick, every repeated phrase a beam. Eventually it forms a structure so familiar that we live inside it without question. It becomes our cognitive home. We look out from its windows and assume we're seeing the world, but we're seeing the world through walls of repetition, through panes of past influence. This is not to say the hall is evil. It is not deception in the malicious sense. It is protection, simplicity, efficiency. A mind can only process so much, and so it builds shortcuts, echoes that do the heavy lifting. But those echoes, once planted, become hard to silence, especially if they come from a voice you once trusted, or wanted to trust, or couldn't afford not to trust. And so, in the middle of this mental hallway, you find yourself surrounded by fragments, by convictions, by doubts. Some of them are not yours. They belong to your culture, your upbringing, your fears, but they sound like you now. They wear your voice. They've practiced your tone. Have you ever stopped to ask, whose voice is echoing in your mind? Is it truly yours? Or did you inherit it? Absorb it in passing? Did it slip in quietly one night while you were tired, scrolling, watching, listening? It's easy to let them stay. The echoes don't demand much. They don't argue. They whisper, gently, patiently. They blend in with your own monologue until the two become indistinguishable, until you're no longer the speaker, just the chamber. And in that quiet chamber, where whispers grow stronger with time, where suggestion becomes belief, where familiarity feels like truth, you find yourself caught, not by force, but by softness, by repetition, by the rhythm of thoughts returning home. But this chamber can be redesigned. It is not a prison, it is a mirror. And once you notice the echo, truly hear it as an echo, you begin to separate it from yourself. You begin to ask, who placed that thought there? Why does it return when I'm vulnerable? Who benefits from me believing this? And just like that, the echo begins to lose its grip, not immediately, but enough for silence to seep in, enough for a new voice to form, yours, not louder, just clearer. And from clarity, a new architecture begins, one of chosen thoughts, slower beliefs, echoes that serve rather than control. And in the stillness of this realization, your mind takes a breath. The hallway no longer defines you. You define the hallway. Some truths are heavy. Their edges are sharp, their presence unsettling. They stir something inside us, making us question, reevaluate, and sometimes ache. But lies, especially the familiar ones, often arrive dressed in soft cotton. They do not startle. They do not sting. Instead, they whisper comfort. They soothe with repetition, like a lullaby hummed in the dark. And so, we hold them. Not because we are fooled, but because we are comforted. The mind is not just a seeker of truth, it is a seeker of safety. And safety often masquerades as the known. When a lie repeats often enough, it builds a home within the folds of memory. It no longer needs proof. It doesn't knock. It simply settles, like dust on an undisturbed shelf. And when faced with the unfamiliar truth, a foreign sound, a colder wind, we turn away, back toward the warmth of the familiar fiction we've learned to call reality. Consider the quiet lie we tell ourselves when love fades. It's just a phase. The words cushion the fall, slow the unraveling. They give us time, space, and a temporary escape from the deeper truth, that all things drift, even hearts. Or the lie that says, "I'm fine," repeated so often it no longer feels like a lie at all. It becomes a habit, a mask stitched into the skin, more familiar than honesty ever was. The comfort of the familiar lie is not about ignorance. It is about preservation. The brain, faced with chaos, chooses coherence. It constructs a world that fits the shape of what we expect, even if the pieces are borrowed or bent. In doing so, it protects the self from dissonance, from fragmentation. And so, in the soft cradle of repetition, lies become lullabies. They hum through our thoughts, calming the anxiety of uncertainty. This is why some stories never die. The myths passed down from generation to generation about identity, history, nation, self. They persist, not because they are always true, but because they are woven into the fabric of belonging. A familiar lie can unite people in shared belief, shared illusion. It can bind families, cultures, and even entire civilizations. Unraveling it would feel like tearing at the seams of existence itself. But there is a cost, always a cost. Comfort bought with illusion is fragile. When the cracks appear, when reality seeps in through the seams, we are often unprepared. The scaffolding collapses. We feel betrayed, not by the lie, but by the fact that we needed it. And in the wreckage we mourn both the truth and the fiction. Still we return to them, the little lies, the internal fictions, the narratives we whisper before sleep. I did my best. They'll come back. Tomorrow will be different. Not because we are foolish, but because we are human, because the night is long, and we are looking for something to hold. And if the truth is a blade, then perhaps the lie is a blanket, threadbare perhaps, but warm. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning, a process not of searching for the truth, but of searching for comfort that can pass as truth. The mind, driven not by accuracy but by emotional equilibrium, selects memories, beliefs, and interpretations that align with what it needs to believe. In this way, the familiar lie becomes a psychological balm. It numbs the sting of reality and gives the mind space to breathe. But here's the paradox. Some lies, though comforting, keep us stagnant. They build walls around the soul. They prevent us from growth, from evolution. A person who tells themselves, "I'm not creative," may never pick up the brush. The child who believes they're unloved might never ask to be held. The employee who thinks, "I'm just lucky to be here," may never ask for more. These lies don't just protect us, they limit us. So what then? Must we rip away the comfort to face the cold? Not always. Sometimes awareness is enough, to see the lie, to name it, to understand why it came, and then to choose. Maybe we keep it a little longer. Maybe we begin to let it go. Truth, after all, is not a fire that burns. It can also be a light that gently warms. And when the time is right, when the heart is steady and the soul ready, we can whisper to ourselves a new story. One stitched not from repetition but from clarity, one that may be unfamiliar at first, a little jagged, a little raw, but real. And in its realness we find a deeper kind of peace, not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of seeing and surviving. So tonight, if you find yourself holding on to an old thought, an old belief, ask, is this true, or is it just familiar? And if it's the latter, do I still need it? Not all lies must be discarded, some must be understood, because even illusions carry meaning. And in understanding them, we learn something far more powerful than any truth or fiction. We learn about ourselves. There are moments when the truth knocks gently at our mental door, but instead of opening it with welcome, we retreat, uneasy. It's not because the truth is too harsh, too wild, or too grand, but simply because it doesn't feel right. We've spent so long wrapped in the softness of a certain idea that when the truth arrives, bare, unfamiliar, and oddly shaped, it feels alien. Not because it is false, but because it does not hum in tune with the melody our minds have been humming for so long. You see, the mind is not always a seeker of truth. It is a seeker of coherence, of patterns, of emotional safety. When something feels consistent with what we already believe, the mind relaxes. When something disrupts that inner harmony, it raises a silent alarm. And so, truth is not always measured by accuracy. Often it is measured by comfort. Imagine standing in a dim room where everything is arranged just so. You know the feel of the floor beneath your feet, the scent of the air, the shadows where they fall. You have been there for years. Then suddenly someone opens the curtains. Light floods in, revealing dust, decay, and a different architecture than you ever imagined. The light is not wrong, but it is disorienting, and you may close the curtain again, not because you hate the light, but because your senses have grown so used to the dark. This is what happens when truth contradicts long-held beliefs. The contradiction isn't just intellectual, it's emotional. It stirs uncertainty, doubt, and for many, those feelings are too unsettling to hold for long. Instead, the mind reshapes the truth, rounds off its sharp corners, buries its more uncomfortable edges. It protects the familiar story like a delicate flame in a windstorm. What's more intriguing is how the body participates in this rejection. Truth, when unwelcome, is not just mentally disruptive. It can be physically felt, a twist in the gut, a racing heart, the tightening of muscles, as if the body itself is shielding us from a reality that might change everything. This is why even in the face of evidence, even in the presence of undeniable facts, people may still choose the illusion. Not out of ignorance, but out of instinct. They are not defending a lie. They are defending the world that lie allowed them to build. And sometimes that world is built not just on stories told, but on identities assumed. When you have lived as someone who believes a certain thing, when your community, your choices, your sense of self has been shaped around that belief, the truth doesn't just ask you to reconsider a fact, it asks you to reconsider yourself. So we resist, not because we are irrational, but because we are human. We are wired to protect the continuity of self. And truth, paradoxically, can feel like a threat to that continuity, especially when it challenges something sacred, a worldview, a memory, a justification, a hope. To accept the truth would mean we were once mistaken. It would mean we might be mistaken again. And few things unsettle the mind more than the possibility that its compass may have pointed the wrong way all along. This is why change, true, deep change, often begins not with data, but with safety, not with facts, but with compassion. When people feel safe, they are more willing to loosen their grip on the comforting fiction. When they feel seen and unjudged, they can begin to question what once felt untouchable. The truth, then, is not a sword to wield, but a seed to plant. And for that seed to grow, the soil must be soft with humility and watered with kindness. Otherwise, even the purest truth will wither in the hard ground of fear and shame. And as you rest here tonight, consider the gentle lies you may still be holding, not out of malice, but out of memory, out of comfort, out of habit. What truths have knocked that you turned away because they didn't feel like home? Let them knock again, quietly. Let them sit beside you without needing to be accepted or rejected. Let them be witnessed. Because the truth that feels wrong today may feel like freedom tomorrow. And in the stillness of night, when the world is quieter and the self is softer, we may find the courage to open the curtain just a little, not to blind ourselves with the light, but to let it begin to enter gently, like dawn. There is a quiet rhythm to existence, a beat beneath consciousness that governs what we call truth. It does not always arrive as a thunderclap of revelation. More often it creeps in like a familiar echo, a word repeated not once or twice, but again and again until the sound becomes the shape of reality. Repetition, in its soft persistence, becomes a sculptor of belief. It carves our minds gently, not with force, but with the comfort of the known, the cadence of the expected. Over time, we stop noticing the voice. We begin to believe it was always there. In this chapter of the mind, where logic bends softly in the wind of familiarity, truth is not what's proven. It's what's heard the most. A phrase whispered often enough no longer feels like suggestion. It becomes memory. It becomes self. The brain, wired for patterns, begins to seek out that familiar string of words in the outside world and, finding them, smiles with satisfaction, confirmation, and comfort. It doesn't question where the phrase came from. It doesn't ask why it appeared again. It simply nods and whispers, "Yes, I've heard this before. This must be true." Repetition is not just a quirk of communication. It is a law of perception. Neural pathways are not forged by novelty. They are deepened by recurrence. Every time we encounter the same phrase, the same story, the same belief, we water a seed that does not die. Even if it began as fiction, repetition feeds it until it grows vines that wrap around certainty itself. That is why propaganda is not loud. It is consistent. That is why rumors do not fade. They are passed along, reshaped slightly, but always recited. That is why advertising works, not by telling us new things, but by reminding us of old ones. The more times we see a message, the more familiar it feels. And familiarity, our brain says, is safety. Familiarity is right. And so we return again and again to the same comforting phrases, not because they are true, but because they are repeated. Everything happens for a reason. You get what you deserve. They are not like us. These are not conclusions. They are echoes, and we live in the chamber that amplifies them. Even memory, the sacred seat of our experience, is vulnerable to repetition. A false memory spoken often enough can become indistinguishable from something lived. And if someone else tells us the story of our life in the same words, enough times we may adopt it. We may cradle it as our own, not because we forgot, but because the rhythm of the tale feels more true than our own silence. There's an illusion at play, subtle and silent. The more a lie is repeated, the more we mistake it for evidence. The brain is not always a courtroom. It is sometimes a choir. It wants harmony. It wants the familiar song. And when a statement is repeated, it harmonizes easily with what we already believe, even if what we believe is based on echoes, not facts. And it's not just the spoken or written word. Repetition shows up in behaviors too, patterns of action, of reaction, of expectation. The same argument replayed in different forms, the same doubt returning in different disguises, the same cycle of decisions again and again, because it feels safe, even if it leads us somewhere we don't want to go. Some of the deepest lies are not shouted. They are whispered within, repeated silently until they feel like the voice of self. I'm not good enough. Nothing ever changes. I always mess it up. These are not truths, but they are practiced, rehearsed, sung inside the theater of the mind so often that they become the script we live by. Yet there is something tender here, too. Repetition is not the villain. It is merely the brush. What we choose to paint with it, that is what matters. The same force that repeats lies can also repeat compassion. The same rhythm that shapes falsehood can also sculpt healing. A kind phrase repeated, a hopeful thought revisited, a gentle truth spoken again and again and again until the mind no longer doubts it. We are not helpless in the face of repetition. We are its co-authors. And if we listen closely, we can ask the questions that break the spell. Is this true, or just familiar? Do I believe this, or have I just heard it enough? Is this my voice, or an echo that I've mistaken for my own? Because once we see the pattern, we can choose a different one. We can whisper a new story into the same silence. And if we repeat it, not loudly, not urgently, but consistently, it too can become real. So as you close your eyes tonight, listen for the repetitions in your mind. Notice the loops, the lines that have played 1,000 times, and gently, softly, without judgment, offer a new line, just one. And then, tomorrow, offer it again, because repetition shapes belief, but belief, once aware, can shape repetition, and in that dance we find our way back to truth. In the quiet hum of nightly thought, where the edges of certainty blur and the shadows of memory lengthen, there stands a figure cloaked not in robes or armor, but in tone. Authority, not the kind that demands, but the kind that suggests, with calm eyes and confident posture. It speaks, and we listen, not because we must, but because something deep within us has been wired to trust the voice that sounds certain. Even in the stillness of doubt, the steady hand of authority becomes a lighthouse in fog. From our earliest moments, we are shaped by structures. Parents, teachers, elders, guides. Their voices fill our empty spaces before we know we have spaces at all. We learn not just language from them, but belief. We inherit their truths like family heirlooms, handed down through gentle repetition and unquestioned patterns. And slowly, what is said becomes what is known. But authority doesn't always arrive with love or guidance. Sometimes it comes in the form of polished speech, fine print, uniforms, badges, doctorates, and titles. It whispers from podiums and screens, behind desks and within headlines. The illusion of authority is not in what is said, but in how it is received. A lie told by someone wearing certainty often outruns a truth delivered with trembling hands. This is the paradox of power in perception. When a statement is delivered by someone deemed credible, by appearance, confidence, or title, our minds become less resistant. We question less. We analyze less. The cognitive strain is reduced. It's easier to believe than to challenge, especially when belief comes prepackaged with the seal of trust. And so, illusions slip through. Not always with malice, sometimes with good intentions. But intentions, like reflections, can distort with distance. A claim becomes a headline. A theory becomes a policy. A guess becomes guidance. And we, drawn to structure like vines to a trellis, grow around the words we are given. The mind's architecture favors shortcuts. It seeks patterns, authority, and repetition, because they conserve energy. When we trust someone or something, we allocate fewer resources to skepticism. This is not a flaw in our intelligence. It is an ancient function of survival. But in the modern world, where voices multiply and certainty is often manufactured, this trust can be turned into a mirror maze. How many times have you seen a falsehood gain strength simply because it was said by someone who should know? A news anchor, a professor, a parent, a stranger in a suit behind a microphone. And yet, the content remains unchanged, the truth or falsity untouched. What changes is our readiness to accept it, our willingness to anchor belief to authority. And once anchored, beliefs rarely drift. We defend them, even when evidence tugs in another direction. Because to question them means to question the figure who gave them to us, and questioning that figure means disturbing the calm certainty we've used to navigate our reality. So, we cling. Not out of ignorance, but out of need. This is the illusion that rests quietly beneath so many systems, the assumption that authority equals accuracy. That knowledge flows in one direction, from the higher to the lower. But wisdom and truth is often found in the quiet margins, in the pause between proclamations. It is the whisper of doubt that asks, "How do you know?" When a figure speaks with conviction, we forget that conviction is not evidence. When a book is published, we forget that publication is not validation. When a voice echoes through generations, we forget that echo is not origin. We forget that humans, even in roles of power, are fallible. That certainty can be practiced like theater. But this realization need not be frightening. It can be freeing. To see the stage is not to dismiss the play, but to understand it more deeply. To hear a voice of authority and still engage your own questions is not rebellion. It is reverence for your own mind. We can respect knowledge without surrendering discernment. We can honor experts while still asking them to show their work. We can walk alongside teachers without abandoning our inner compass. And we can remember always that the illusion of truth is strongest when it wears the costume of certainty. So tonight, as you rest in the soft murmur of thought, let your mind wander into the corridors of voices you've trusted. Feel their weight, their warmth, their presence, and ask gently, not with suspicion but with curiosity, what lies beneath their words. Were they truths? Were they echoes? Were they well-meaning illusions? Because the mind, so eager to find anchors, deserves to know the depth of the waters it sails. And authority, while a helpful guide, is not the destination. It is a signpost. You are the traveler. And your journey begins where certainty ends. Let this be a comfort, not a burden. You are not lost in illusion. You are awake in wonder. It begins not with a shout, but a murmur, a quiet agreement, a nod in the background. One voice finds another, and then another, until the soft ripple becomes a wave. And before long, it feels as if everyone is saying the same thing. Not because they all believe it, but because everyone else seems to. You are not alone in thinking differently, but you feel alone in saying it aloud. So you keep your thoughts folded, tucked beneath the blanket of general agreement. It's warmer there, safer. After all, if the crowd believes it, surely there must be truth in it. Surely the weight of so many minds must form something solid. But consensus, as comforting as it feels, can be crafted from illusion. It does not always emerge from truth. It can emerge from fear, from silence, from momentum. The mind craves the path of least resistance, and resistance often wears the face of dissent. Questioning the common narrative requires effort, courage, vulnerability. Far easier to drift gently with the tide than to wade against it. Far easier to nod in agreement than to raise a hand in uncertainty. So the illusion deepens, not by the strength of belief, but by the absence of open contradiction. Imagine a room filled with people who each harbor a quiet doubt. But none speak it because they fear being alone. And because no one speaks, each believes they are the only one who doubts. The silence becomes a signal, a phantom agreement, a false majority. It is not a consensus of thought, it is a consensus of expression. This is the spiral of silence, and it feeds the illusion. There is something eerily fragile about a belief system that stands only because no one dares to question it. It is a castle built on hush, a structure held up not by pillars of truth, but by a fear of standing out. A collective hush that grows louder than any scream. Over time, the illusion solidifies. What began as pretense becomes performance. What was once caution becomes comfort. We forget we're pretending. The silence becomes part of the scenery. And the story repeats. In history, the illusion of consensus has echoed through politics, religions, ideologies, entire civilizations. Great injustices perpetuated not because everyone believed them to be right, but because too few believed they could be wrong together. The more voices that echoed the claim, the more real it became, until reality itself bent around the echo. Psychologists call it pluralistic ignorance, a state where individuals privately reject a belief but assume everyone else accepts it, so they conform outwardly, and the conformity becomes data, a signal, a wave. Soon perception overwhelms truth. This illusion is not reserved for the masses. It can live in families, in boardrooms, in classrooms. It thrives in closed spaces where questioning feels unsafe, where truth has been replaced with tone, where peace is measured by agreement, not by understanding. But here's the quiet paradox. Within the illusion lies a secret door. Because just as one voice can vanish into the crowd, one voice can also unravel it. The moment someone speaks the doubt aloud, the silence fractures. Heads turn, others nod, cautiously, then with relief. The curtain lifts, and it becomes clear. The consensus was never as unanimous as it seemed, but it takes one, just one. The illusion is strongest when people underestimate the power of their own voice. It whispers, "It's not worth it. You'll stand alone. You're the only one who sees it differently." And when we believe that whisper, we become another pillar in the illusion structure. To question does not mean to oppose. To speak does not mean to fight. Sometimes to simply ask, "Is this true?" is the act that cracks the spell. And the spell is real. The brain seeks validation in numbers. It is comforted by belonging. It rewires itself to fit the collective rhythm. But not all rhythms are in harmony with truth. In a world flooded with noise, algorithms, and curated realities, the illusion of consensus grows stronger. What we see more, we believe more. What is repeated becomes familiar, and what is familiar becomes safe. But not all safe things are true. As your thoughts drift in the space between awareness and surrender, consider this. What if the beliefs that feel universal are simply well-rehearsed? What if the silence isn't agreement but a shared hesitation? And what if, tucked quietly in the mind of another, your unspoken doubt already lives? The illusion of consensus is not a flaw in the human mind. It is a side effect of our longing to belong. But the same mind that seeks comfort in the crowd also carries the courage to step beyond it. So, in the quiet folds of sleep, as certainty softens and imagination deepens, let this thought linger gently. What is popular is not always true, and what is true is not always loud. Sometimes truth is the quiet breath before the first word, the flicker before the spark. The world doesn't speak to us. It echoes, in endless polished loops, in soft voices made louder through design, timing, and intent. Advertising doesn't just sell us products, it sells us rhythms of belief, planted in repetition, watered by suggestion, and harvested in silence. This is the echo effect. Not an announcement, but a whisper repeated until it wears a path in the mind. Close your eyes and drift into a city street. Neon pulses across glass, screens blink in synchronized choreography. A billboard hums above. In your hand, your device glows with the same message, said differently. In a jingle, in a headline, in the subtle placement of a logo within a dreamlike landscape. You're not told what to want. You're shown again and again what others appear to already want. And that is enough. The echo begins gently, a brand name mentioned in passing, a slogan drifting past the corner of your screen, a product placement in a scene you were too tired to question. You didn't notice it then, but now it's here again, and again, and again, each time less foreign, each time more familiar. until one day it doesn't feel like someone else's idea. It feels like yours. That is the power of the echo. Not to inform, not to persuade, but to transform the strange into the trusted, the alien into the obvious. And it works not because the content is true, but because it is heard often. Frequency begins to masquerade as accuracy. Just as footsteps create a trail in the grass, repetition clears a root in the brain. You don't need to understand a message for it to take root. You only need to encounter it enough times. Advertising's genius lies not in clarity but in volume, and in the ability to disguise that volume behind different masks. A podcast host's passing recommendation, a friend's unconscious mimicry, a catchy chorus stitched into the fabric of a memory. These aren't ads, your mind thinks. These are reflections. Reflections you trust. The echo shapes desire before you even know it. It speaks in the language of emotions, not logic. You're not asked to compare features or price. You're invited to imagine a better self, a brighter moment, a version of your life where the right pair of shoes makes all the difference. This fantasy, offered quietly and often, becomes a dream you don't remember inventing. And in the dream, the product isn't the focus. You are. The echo surrounds you with images of others who look fulfilled, free, adored. They are always smiling, always just like you, but slightly improved. Their skin glows, their rooms are organized, their lives are curated to appear effortless. And somehow, the same drink, the same phone, the same fragrance is always within reach. But here's the quiet truth that lingers beneath it all. Advertising doesn't need to deceive you. It only needs to repeat itself. The more you hear a message, the less resistance your mind offers. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort opens the door to belief. The echo doesn't argue, it doesn't reason, it reflects. Back at you, at your insecurities, your hopes, your sense of identity. It mirrors your fears just long enough to offer a solution, one that can be purchased. And just like that, truth becomes a mood, not a fact. Even the skeptical are not immune. Even those who know, who understand the mechanics behind the illusion, feel its pull. Because repetition works not on belief, but on exposure. Knowing something is an echo does not silence it. It only makes the sound more sophisticated, more difficult to resist. In the quiet of your room, when your thoughts settle, the echo remains, playing softly in the background like a lullaby. A brand name emerges uninvited. A slogan completes itself without your help. You chuckle, surprised that you remember it. But that is the point. The echo doesn't want your approval. It only wants access, and it has it. Now imagine a world where every surface speaks, where every scroll is a loop, where silence is rare and the only truth is what is most often said. In that world, who decides what is real? What part of you remains untouched? You begin to see how advertising isn't about selling, it's about shaping. Shaping the space where belief grows, shaping the vocabulary you use to express desire, shaping the dreams that drift into your sleep. It isn't evil, it is patient. The echo is not a scream, it is a hum. And in its vibration, truth and fiction blur until what is repeated becomes what is remembered, and what is remembered becomes what is real. So let your mind rest now. Drift through the echoes with awareness, not fear. You are not powerless, you are simply porous. And in that porousness lies your deepest vulnerability and your greatest opportunity. To hear, to know, and to choose before the echo chooses for you. In the stillness of thought, where ideas are believed to rise from within, an invisible hand gently shapes what we accept as truth. It doesn't shout, it doesn't argue, it merely points, quietly, as others follow. And soon, without a single word exchanged, we are walking a path not chosen by will, but by the whisper of the crowd's footsteps. This is the silent gravity of social proof. We are creatures of belonging, not by weakness but by design. In the vast and unpredictable world, Safety often hides in numbers. If 1,000 eyes look in one direction, we are wired to wonder what they see. And in that wondering, a subtle shift occurs. What once was uncertain begins to feel certain. What once was questioned starts to feel natural. And what was merely one of many possibilities becomes the only one we truly consider. You walk into a room and see a crowd facing a blank wall. No one speaks, no signs, just silence and shared posture. Do you turn and look with them? Most do, not because they are convinced, but because they are compelled. The mind reasons, surely they know something I don't. It feels safer to align, to blend in with the pattern of others' choices than to risk standing in uncertainty alone. And once we conform, belief often follows. This is the seed of influence, silent, ambient, and profoundly persuasive. The repeated lies that become truths do not always arrive through repetition alone. Sometimes they wear the faces of our friends. They echo in the laughter of dinner tables, the nods in meetings, the applause in a crowd. The truth becomes not what is proven, but what is shared. The lie, repeated and socially reinforced, grows roots in the quiet soil of group behavior. And it grows best where no one is willing to question aloud. Consider the bystander who does not intervene because others remain still, the student who believes a false answer because the class agrees, the viewer who trusts a story because the comment section glows with approval. These moments accumulate imperceptibly until we mistake consensus for truth. We forget that 1,000,000 people can be wrong in unison, but their unity deceives us. Social proof does not only shape belief, it silences doubt. To question what everyone else accepts is to invite exile, even if the exile is just a look, a pause, or an unreturned nod. The brain, ever efficient, often avoids this pain. It adapts, it aligns, and slowly it accepts. Not because the evidence has grown, but because the risk of questioning has. So the repeated lie, when supported by the crowd, takes on a second life. Not only is it repeated, it is believed together. And belief, when multiplied, is hard to escape. Even more haunting is that social proof does not need to be real. In the digital age, numbers lie. Bots simulate agreement, views are purchased, follower counts are inflated, and yet the mind reacts all the same. We see the metrics and our instincts respond. Everyone believes this. Maybe I should too. But the crowd may be a ghost, and the proof manufactured. Still, the illusion shapes reality. This is how silent influence thrives, not through force, but through suggestion, not through reason, but through comfort. It offers the safety of belonging in exchange for the quiet abandonment of doubt. There's nothing inherently sinister in our desire to belong. It is human, it is ancient, but it is also exploitable. And when the repeated meets the socially affirmed, truth becomes a performance more than a discovery. What matters is not what is true, but what is repeated by many. So, how do we protect ourselves from believing what everyone else believes for no reason other than that they believe it? We begin by listening for silence. Not the silence of meditation, but the silence of hesitation, the moments when a group does not debate, when everyone agrees too easily, when dissent vanishes without resistance. In these silences, truth may be hiding or already lost. We also cultivate the practice of slow belief. Instead of asking, "Do others believe this?" we ask, "Why do I believe this?" And more importantly, when did I start believing it? And who was I with? These questions restore authorship to our convictions, removing them from the invisible pen of the crowd. Sometimes the loneliest thought is the truest one. Sometimes the most repeated words are the least examined, and sometimes truth feels unfamiliar precisely because it has not yet been echoed. Social proof may point us toward reality, but it may also lead us away from it. So we walk the narrow space between others and ourselves, grateful for shared knowledge, yet aware of its dangers. We seek the warmth of community, but not at the cost of clarity. We learn to love the feeling of being wrong because it means we are still thinking for ourselves. And in this quiet resistance, we reclaim the right to believe slowly, to question gently, and to remember that truth is not determined by volume nor by vote. It is discovered in silence, chosen in solitude, and held in the heart even when the world turns its gaze elsewhere. Memory is often imagined as a sacred archive, a vault of truth carefully organized within the chambers of our mind. But the mind is not a library, and memory is no librarian. It does not catalog with precision, nor does it preserve with constancy. Instead, memory is like water, reflective, fluid, and disturbingly vulnerable to ripple. In the quiet theater of the mind, a scene replays. You're certain you were there. The voices sound familiar. The air carried a scent you now recall. Yet none of it may be real. The memory was planted not with deceit, but through suggestion, through repetition, through the gentle pressure of recall, guided not by your own will but by the environment around you. False memories are not fantasies, they are convincing echoes. The more they are summoned, the more real they feel. The mind reshapes itself each time a memory is retrieved. It is not a tape that replays exactly. It is a painting redrawn, colors slightly shifted, edges softened or exaggerated. And the brush is held not only by your hand, but by the words of others, the subtle cues of images, the repeated patterns you absorb without resistance. Repetition has a strange power. When a narrative is told again and again, even without evidence, it weaves itself into the fabric of the past. We do not just remember, we reconstruct. And in that reconstruction lies vulnerability. The more often a story is repeated, the more it feels familiar. And in the realm of memory, familiarity is often mistaken for truth. Consider how easily a photograph can become an anchor. Show someone a doctored image from their childhood, and with enough prompting, they begin to recall the event it depicts. The picnic in the park, the balloon in their hand, the laughter. None of it happened, but the mind, eager to comply, to complete, to make sense, fills in the blanks. It does not resist. It welcomes the illusion as if it had always been there. This fragility is not a flaw. It is a feature of survival. The mind evolved to prioritize coherence over accuracy, to remember the story that keeps the self intact, not the one that mirrors objective reality. In a chaotic world, consistency is safety. And so, when a message is repeated, when an idea loops again and again through media, conversation, and internal thought, it finds a groove, a path of least resistance, and the mind, seeking ease, begins to travel it effortlessly. But ease is not truth. A repeated lie does not become real, yet it becomes memorable. And the memorable masquerades as trustworthy. It whispers familiarity, and the mind sighs, accepting it as its own. This is the danger. A lie does not need force, it needs rhythm. Told with enough frequency, it need not even be persuasive. It only needs to be heard. Again, and again, and again. And suddenly your own voice begins to echo it without knowing where it came from. The fragility of memory means we must tread carefully. Every retelling alters the shape. Every recollection is a rehearsal that edits as much as it preserves. And when repetition is used not for reflection, but manipulation, the self becomes a theater for someone else's play. Yet there is hope in awareness. When we recognize memory's softness, we do not despair. We become gentle with ourselves. We stop clinging to certainty and begin embracing mystery. We accept that not all we recall is fact, and not all that others recall is fiction. We become patient with disagreements, humble with our recollections, curious about the origins of our beliefs. And in that curiosity lies freedom. Memory, like language, is a living thing. It is shaped by what we hear, see, and say. And while this makes it vulnerable, it also makes it dynamic. We are not prisoners to false memory. but participants in the ongoing creation of our own internal world. So the next time a memory surfaces, clear, confident, yet oddly pristine, pause. Ask where it came from. Trace its edges. Is it an echo? Is it yours? Or has it been whispered to you so often you mistook the whisper for your own voice? In the dim corridors of thought, truth and illusion often wear the same robes. The only light we have is awareness, not to catch every falsehood, but to walk slowly, to listen carefully, to accept the mind's limits with grace. Memory is not a mirror. It is a canvas, and every day the brush returns. Choose the strokes with care. Let repetition serve wonder, not deception. Let the echoes be questioned. Let the fragile be honored. For in doing so, we do not erase illusion. We learn to see through it. And that is where clarity begins. Truth doesn't always arrive with clarity or evidence. Sometimes it arrives cloaked in the warmth of familiarity, like a voice we think we've heard before, or a phrase that hums, a melody already buried in the back of our minds. We believe not because we've examined the details or verified the claims, but because the idea feels like an old friend knocking gently at the door of recognition. This is the strange power of repetition, how the mind in its quiet corners treats the familiar as the believable. When something echoes through the corridors of our memory often enough, it begins to shed the uncertainty of novelty and adopt the comfort of truth. It might be a headline, a rumor, a whisper, told 3 times in 3 slightly different ways. But with every return, the idea gains a layer of credibility not because of its merit, but because of its frequency. There is no formal handshake between familiarity and truth, but there is a secret nod, a psychological nod that bypasses critical thought and slips into our intuition. The brain, after all, is not designed to dissect every claim. It is designed to conserve energy, to use shortcuts. And so, when it sees an idea it has seen before, it often grants it a softer, gentler reception. You've heard this before, the brain says, therefore it must be safe. In the soft silence of unexamined belief, the false familiar thrives. It lives in advertising slogans we recite without knowing why. In historical narratives we never questioned, in the tiny sayings our parents told us, passed down like heirlooms, not because they were right, but because they were repeated. We think we're remembering, but often we're simply recognizing. And recognition in the calm sleepiness of our mental processes is mistaken for reality. This is not a flaw in our minds. It is part of our architecture, a protective function. We are creatures who must act on incomplete information, and so our brains are wired to rely on fluency. The easier something is to process, the more we trust it. The smoother the sentence, the more natural the rhythm, the more familiar the phrasing. These things feel right, even if they are wrong, and once something feels right, we rarely question it. Consider how many times you've nodded along to a phrase simply because it felt true, only to later learn it had no foundation in fact. The emotion of agreement is subtle. It comes before thought, not after. It emerges not from scrutiny but from resonance, like a tuning fork gently humming to a frequency it has heard before. This illusion of truth, born from the soft blanket of the familiar, is what advertisers, politicians, and propagandists have long known how to use. Repeat the message over and over until resistance gives way not to conviction but to quiet acceptance. The familiar becomes a cushion, and cushions, by design, reduce impact. In this way, the repetition of a false idea doesn't slam into us with urgency. It simply sits beside us long enough that we begin to forget it was ever a stranger. Even in ourselves, this illusion weaves its way through memory and belief. We begin to believe things about our past, about our identity, not because they were accurate, but because we've told ourselves the story often enough, that we're not good at something, that a certain person always treated us badly, that a moment happened in a certain way. But memory is fragile, and repetition carves grooves. The familiar story becomes the only version we can hear. We carry these stories with us like old jackets, worn, patched, and comfortable, not necessarily because they fit, but because we've had them for so long. And so the false familiar isn't just an external phenomenon. It lives inside us, in our recollections, in our assumptions, in our explanations. But if repetition can lull us into false belief, it can also be a tool for awakening. By gently repeating truths, by exposing ourselves to honest ideas, to sincere thinking, to the uncomfortable and the new, we can reshape what feels familiar. We can build a new resonance, one more aligned with what is real. The path is slow, but it is possible. Every time we question an old thought, every time we pause before nodding to a familiar phrase, we break the trance. And in that break, a moment of clarity can seep through. Not all familiarity is false, but when truth is measured by ease and comfort, we must be cautious, because not all that feels right is real, and not all that is real feels right at first. As you drift deeper into the quiet of thought, consider the echoes that you carry, the phrases you trust, the ideas you accept. Ask yourself not just whether they are familiar, but whether they are true. Let that be your compass, not the warmth of recognition, but the light of understanding. And in that gentle pursuit, may you find not just sleep, but awareness wrapped in stillness. A fact stands still, cold, indifferent, unchanging. It waits, unnoticed, among the clutter of daily noise, carrying no melody, offering no embrace, but a story moves, it breathes, it whispers your name in a voice that feels like memory. It takes the same fact, drapes it in emotion, anchors it in a face, a moment, a heartbeat, and suddenly, the truth you ignored becomes something you feel, not because it's proven, but because it's lived. We are creatures built not to calculate, but to remember, and what we remember is rarely statistical. We recall the flicker in a stranger's eyes, not the percentage of those who suffer. We repeat the parable, not the peer-reviewed journal. The neuron prefers rhythm over rigor. The heart listens first. In the deep corridors of the mind, facts wander like lost echoes unless tethered to narrative. This is why the one story of a child, saved by a miracle, grips tighter than a mountain of studies on probability. The story touches us because it activates the machinery that kept our ancestors alive. Before science, there were fireside tales. Before logic, there was meaning. This preference is not a flaw. It is an adaptation. In a world too complex to measure, stories helped us decide. A rustle in the grass wasn't assessed through data. It was woven into a tale of lurking danger. Survival did not come from accuracy, but from belief. And so belief was given to the story, not the number. But in this gift lies the illusion. When stories come cloaked in repetition, when their rhythm pulses with familiarity, they begin to replace the facts they once served to explain. We feel the story's truth more deeply than the truth itself, and once a narrative carves its path into our emotional terrain, it resists all contradiction. Even when the evidence speaks, even when the facts knock louder. This is how myths become memories, how rumors outlast reports, how slogans outlive science. A story told well enough, told often enough, begins to substitute for reality, not because it is truer, but because it is easier to carry. We do not argue against logic. We simply forget it. The emotional resonance of the story silences the uncomfortable friction of doubt. A clean narrative gives us relief. It ends the sentence, offers closure, answers the aching ambiguity of life. Facts, in contrast, often demand more questions. Consider the sway of political speeches, the pull of a moving testimonial, the viral spread of a compelling anecdote. They are crafted not to inform, but to persuade. And persuasion lives in emotion. The facts might be thin, the logic fractured, but if the story sings in the right key, our minds will harmonize. Even our memories are not immune. They reshape to fit the stories we tell about ourselves. The past becomes a curated reel, facts rearranged to suit the arc. We become not just the product of what happened, but of how we choose to remember it. Story edits memory, gently, insistently, and yet we trust the story. Because it feels real, because it sounds like something we would say, because it echoes what we've heard before. This is the cognitive illusion. Fluency becomes credibility. A well-told lie feels truer than a poorly stated truth, and the line between feeling and fact dissolves into sleep. In this quiet erosion, reality shifts. Not in sudden breaks, but in subtle tilts. A single story retold reshapes a culture. A myth repeated becomes a national identity, and what is no longer verified is still believed because it was told with conviction. We live in an age saturated with stories, from screens, from posts, from ads, from voices both familiar and manufactured. Each competes not just for attention, but for allegiance. And the ones that win are not the ones with the strongest evidence, but the strongest emotional pull. So how do we anchor ourselves? How do we stay awake in the sea of stories? It begins with slowing down, with recognizing the seduction, with asking not only what the story says, but how it makes us feel, and why. Not all stories deceive, many illuminate, but when the story replaces the question with certainty, when it silences the mind with comfort, it's time to lean into the discomfort of doubt. It is doubt, not belief, that keeps us open. It is humility, not confidence, that keeps us grounded. The story is powerful. It builds nations, binds communities, births revolutions. But it can also blind. To see clearly, we must listen, not just with the heart, but with the whole mind. Because while the story guides us through the dark, it is the quiet truth beneath it that lights the path home. The words echo not by accident, but by design. In the great arenas of politics and ideology, repetition is not just a habit, it is a weapon. It molds, carves, reshapes. It creates tribes not by logic, but by rhythm. Phrases repeat like a chant, like a hymn, like the pulsing heartbeat of belief systems passed from mouth to ear and back again. Over time, the repetition is no longer noticed. It is embedded. It becomes culture. And culture, once internalized, becomes truth. But this truth is not necessarily rooted in evidence. It does not need to be. When something is heard often enough, it begins to feel familiar. And when it feels familiar, it begins to feel safe. And when it feels safe, it begins to feel true. Not because it is, but because our minds equate repetition with reality. This is not a glitch. It is a feature. Evolution shaped our brains to trust the patterns we've seen before, to navigate danger by leaning into the known. In the wilderness, this kept us alive. In society, it makes us vulnerable. Enter politics, a theater where words are staged with precision. Slogans are not chosen for their logic, but for their cadence. Simplicity is power. A single phrase, repeated, shouted, posted, shared, does not ask for reflection. It bypasses thought. It goes straight to the limbic system, where fear lives, where tribalism is born. And soon, this phrase becomes identity. One doesn't just believe it. One belongs to it. And when we belong, we defend. Not always the content of the message, but the rhythm of it. The repetition becomes a signal of loyalty, of allegiance, of community. Whether in a crowd waving flags or in a quiet home, nodding along to the radio, the effect is the same. The repeated message tells us who we are and who we are not. It divides, it organizes, it excludes. The politics of the repeat thrives in sound bites. A long, nuanced discussion rarely survives the cut. But a three-word phrase, that can circle the globe. It can fit on a bumper sticker. It can be worn on a hat. It can be whispered into algorithms and shouted into microphones. It mutates as it spreads, but the emotional core remains intact. It promises clarity in a complicated world, and we accept that promise, not because it's deep, but because it's familiar. And here lies the paradox. The more a phrase is repeated, the less we examine it. Its meaning ossifies. It becomes a fossil we wear without questioning. Ask someone what it truly means, and they might pause. Because often it's not about the words, it's about the feeling they evoke. A sense of belonging, a sense of being right, of being on the side that speaks the truth, simply because it is the side that echoes our chosen chant. In this landscape, opposing ideas don't just feel different, they feel dangerous, not because they're wrong, but because they interrupt the flow of our internal music. They introduce dissonance where we've been lulled by harmony. This is why propaganda doesn't need to argue, it only needs to repeat. Repetition doesn't ask for consent, it creates it. The tribal truth formed by repetition becomes armor. When challenged, we don't defend the idea, we defend ourselves. Because to reject the phrase is to risk exile from the group that gave us identity. And so we double down, we repost, we retweet, we chant louder. Not to persuade others, but to remind ourselves, to stay anchored in the current of certainty, even if the river flows in circles. What makes the politics of repetition so powerful is its invisibility. No one thinks they've been influenced. They think they've come to the truth on their own. But if you trace their beliefs backwards, not to their thoughts, but to their exposure, you'll often find the same phrase, heard again and again until it felt inevitable. And that's the danger. Not in belief, but in the illusion of its origin. Not in holding ideas, but in forgetting how we acquired them. We are not immune. None of us are. Even the most skeptical minds are shaped by exposure. The key is not to silence repetition, but to see it, to recognize when we're being played like an instrument designed to hum a particular tune. So, in a world where ideologies compete by echo, let the whisper of awareness be your compass. Ask not just what you believe, but how many times you've heard it. Trace the origin of the phrase back to its first utterance. Listen for the intention beneath the cadence, and in doing so, you may find a stillness beyond the chant. A space where thought is not shaped by rhythm, but by reflection. Because truth does not always arrive wearing a slogan. Sometimes it comes quietly, without repetition, without applause, just a small, unassuming voice in a crowded room of echoes, asking gently, "Is this yours, or was it given to you?" And in that question lies freedom. There is something quietly astonishing about the way repetition weaves itself into the fabric of who we believe we are. Not just the beliefs we hold, but the way those beliefs start to hold us. Like vines curling around the beams of a forgotten house, certain phrases echo so often that they cease to be echoes and begin to feel like origin. The mind, eager for stability, reaches for what it has heard the most, and if it's heard a lie again and again, it will begin to stitch that lie into the quilt of selfhood. It begins with a whisper. Maybe you were told you were clumsy, or incapable, or brilliant, or destined for greatness. The truth of the statement doesn't matter, not at first. What matters is that you heard it not once, but many times, and with each echo your brain, ever attuned to patterns, began filing that whisper away, not as external noise, but as internal truth. Over time, that idea, true or false, sank below the level of scrutiny. It became part of your story. You began to describe yourself using its vocabulary, not because you analyzed it and found it accurate, but because it was familiar. It had been repeated enough to earn the badge of self-evidence. There's a reason the term self-image contains the word image. We do not often see ourselves directly, no, instead we collect snapshots from the outside world, impressions gathered from comments, culture, and the unspoken expectations that press in like fog. And repetition acts like the photographer. The more often we see a version of ourselves reflected back to us, the more we begin to pose for it. We adjust our posture, our words, our decisions to match that reflection. Eventually, we forget we're performing at all. It becomes a kind of trance, one in which the phrase you've heard 100 times becomes not just something you believe, but something you are. Not just, I heard I'm not creative, but I'm not a creative person. Not just, they said I talk too much, but I am too much. Not just, this is what people like me believe, but this is who I am. We mistake the well-worn path for the only path. This transformation, where repeated lies become adopted beliefs, and adopted beliefs become identity, is subtle but profound. It's the reason propaganda works. It's the reason manipulative advertising works. It's the reason children raised in environments of love or cruelty grow into adults who carry those echoes in their bones. We are not immune to repetition. In fact, we are most vulnerable to it when it hides beneath the surface, when it slips into our sense of self. And it's not just about damage. Sometimes repeated encouragements become self-fulfilling. A child told they are brave begins to take risks. A student told they are smart begins to work harder. But even this has a shadow. When praise becomes part of identity, failure feels like an existential threat. If "I am smart" is repeated enough, a single failure can shatter the self. Because it wasn't just a mistake, it was a violation of who we were told we are. The illusion of permanence is perhaps the cruelest trick repetition plays. It tells us that our identity is fixed, fossilized, non-negotiable, that what we've always heard must always be true. But identity, like belief, is porous. It absorbs, adapts, sheds, grows. The lie that has lived in you for decades can still be questioned. The story you've told yourself can still be rewritten. To question these repeated beliefs is not betrayal, it is reclamation. The voice in your mind that insists you'll never be enough may not be your voice at all. It may belong to a parent, a teacher, a culture. The phrase you carry like a scar may have been repeated into you, not born from you. And if it was repeated in, it can be replaced. With care, with intention, with truth. This is not easy. The lies that shape our identities are often tied to survival. A child who was told they had to be obedient to be loved learns to fuse compliance with safety. A person told they were strong, every time they hid their pain, learns to equate silence with worth. These are not just ideas. They are coping mechanisms forged in repetition. Undoing them requires patience, gentleness, and sometimes grief. But it can be done. Through stillness, through curiosity, through learning to recognize the difference between a belief that was earned and one that was inherited, between a truth that was discovered and one that was installed. The brain does not care if something is true. It cares if something is familiar. But we as conscious beings have the rare ability to step outside that loop, to ask gently, where did this thought come from? Who first spoke it? Why did I believe it? And do I still want to? Repetition is not destiny. Identity is not a life sentence. You are not obligated to remain the person repetition convinced you to be. The script can be rewritten, even if the old lines still echo, especially if they do. In the soft quiet of reflection, you can begin to unthread the borrowed from the true. And in doing so, begin to see yourself not as a collection of repeated phrases, but as something deeper, something real, something that is, finally, your own. There is a strange softness to the way a child hears the world, a kind of openness that doesn't question, doesn't yet know to question. In this early and unguarded state, repetition is not merely an echo, it becomes the architecture of reality. Words spoken in the kitchen, glances exchanged in the hallway, tone, gesture, silence. Each is absorbed not as opinion, but as truth. The child doesn't filter for lies, doesn't test for bias. What is repeated is remembered. What is remembered becomes belief. And so it is that the most enduring illusions are often planted not with malice, but with routine. They arrive not as commands, but as lullabies. You're so smart, you're difficult, be strong, don't cry. That's not for people like us. The world is dangerous. Money is everything. Love hurts. Each phrase, repeated not once but hundreds of times in subtle variations, burrows into the folds of the developing mind. These are not statements. They are seeds, and once embedded, they grow roots that wrap around identity, quietly informing every future interpretation of self and of others. Repetition in childhood carries a kind of authority beyond logic. It enters when the walls of critical thinking haven't yet been built. Imagine walking through a forest where every tree grew from the same strange seed, where every turn, every fork in the path is lined with the familiar echoes of what you've always been told. You do not question the forest, because it is all you've known. In this way, many of our most persistent illusions are not chosen, they are inherited. And these beliefs, these impressions that harden over time, become invisible lenses through which we experience life. They determine what feels possible, what feels safe, what feels true, and what feels dangerous, even if no danger is present. The child who was told that the world is cruel may grow into an adult who flinches at kindness. The child who heard they were unwanted may interpret love as conditional, fleeting, unearned. The repetition need not be loud. In fact, it's often whispered, or worse, implied. But its impact is enduring. There is a haunting simplicity in how easily the mind mistakes familiarity for fact. Not because it is lazy, but because it is loyal. The brain's deepest drive is to create coherence, to preserve a sense of self. And if that self was forged in repetition, then change feels like betrayal. Even if the belief is painful, even if it no longer fits, it is still familiar. And the familiar feels like home. To undo such imprints requires more than awareness. It requires tenderness. It requires the willingness to sit with discomfort, to hold old beliefs in your hands and ask, where did you come from? Who first whispered you into me? And do you still deserve to live inside my mind? But most of us don't ask these questions, not because we are afraid of the answers, but because we've forgotten that the questions can even be asked, that the forest we walk through isn't the only one, that we can plant new seeds. That repetition works both ways. The very mechanism that once forged illusion can be used to soften it, to rewrite it, slowly, gently. Truth, too, gains strength with repetition. Kindness, too, can become a habit of thought. There is beauty in the mind's plasticity, in its quiet ability to reshape, to forgive itself for what it once believed. But this only happens when we stop treating childhood beliefs as sacred and start treating them as starting points. When we stop defending the old truths simply because they are old. In the dim hours of night, when the world is quiet and thoughts drift untethered, this realization can emerge softly, like a forgotten song returning in fragments, that you are not the story you were told. You are not the summary of repeated judgments. You are not the echoes. You are the one who hears them, and that makes you free. And maybe that's the real miracle, that even if repetition builds the walls of illusion, it also offers us the tools to carve windows into them. That even if your forest was planted long ago, you can begin, tonight, to plant new trees, because the child within us may still listen. And now, with gentler words, we can speak again. The most enduring lies are rarely shouted. They do not need volume. They slip past our defenses not by force, but by attire. And when a lie comes dressed in the clothes of logic, stitched with the language of science, it can walk into the mind without knocking. This is the deception in disguise, when illusion doesn't deny reason, but mimics it, when falsehood wears the solemn face of data, the sterile tone of research, the confident rhythm of expertise. The lie becomes elegant, articulate. It moves with the posture of truth. And so we nod, we believe. But beneath the surface, something doesn't quite settle. A quiet unease hums beneath the numbers, behind the graphs, within the jargon. We sense something off, though we struggle to name it. It is as if we are offered a map, beautiful and precise, only to realize, far too late, it leads us in circles. This is no attack on science, which at its core is a method, a mirror polished by doubt. But it is a reminder that science, too, can be manipulated when used not as a lantern to illuminate, but as a costume to conceal. There are lies that come wrapped in studies. One set of data, carefully framed, selectively quoted, becomes a weapon of persuasion. A chart, stripped of its context, can speak louder than the truth ever could. A study with no peer review can still echo across a million minds if repeated enough, if dressed in the right citations, if spoken in the right tone. We trust the structure. We trust the white coats, the acronyms, the meticulous formatting. We confuse the appearance of rigor with the presence of truth. And so, marketing borrows from medicine, pseudoscience borrows from psychology, propaganda borrows from public policy. And slowly, the foundation of belief begins to blur. You read that something is proven, that something is clinically tested, that research shows or experts agree. And yet, what lies beneath may be thin scaffolding, hollow studies, or results that were never replicated. But the form remains persuasive. Because it looks like science, because it feels like certainty, it becomes harder to question. Doubt becomes impolite. Silence becomes easier. This chapter is not about cynicism, it's about discernment, because even the clearest mirror can be angled to distort, and even honest data can be misused by dishonest hands. Deception in disguise thrives in complexity. The more intricate the theory, the harder it is to challenge. The more sophisticated the terms, the more the lay person retreats. It creates an illusion of expertise that demands quiet compliance, not critical thought. You may find yourself nodding along to an article filled with terminology you don't quite understand. You may hear a speaker quote numbers with precision, voice calm, gaze unwavering, and a part of you relaxes, not because you understand, but because you assume they do. This is the trick. The illusion doesn't need to fool your reason. It only needs to overwhelm it. It doesn't silence your questions. It teaches you not to ask. But questions are not rebellion. They are reverence for truth. The antidote to deception is not distrust. It is curiosity. It is the ability to pause and wonder, who benefits from me believing this? What is missing from this picture? What would the counterpoint say if given space? Because truth rarely fears the full picture. It doesn't shrink under scrutiny. Only deception requires dim lighting and selective framing. And so, the work of the mind is not to accept or reject in haste, but to dwell in the space between. To examine not just the words, but the motivations behind them. To trace not just what is said, but what is left unsaid. Deception in disguise teaches us that sometimes the most dangerous falsehoods are not the ones we instantly reject, but the ones we never think to question. The ones that sound familiar, the ones that comfort us with their structure, the ones that echo the rhythm of reason, but never its substance. In the quiet moments, ask yourself, have I accepted this because I understand it, or because it was packaged to feel undeniable? The mind, after all, seeks certainty, but wisdom learns to live with uncertainty, to walk through doubt with steady steps, to know that not all clarity is truth, and not all complexity is deception. And if we're honest, we've all worn masks. We've all cloaked uncertainty and confidence. We've all shaped our words to appear wiser than we felt. It is human to disguise, and it is human to believe the disguise of others. But in knowing this, we begin to see the mask, not to reject everything that wears one, but to look beyond it, to look again. And in doing so, we reclaim the power of sight. So, lie back, breathe, let your thoughts drift not into certainty but into stillness. Let the quiet unwrap the layers. Let the disguise fall softly. There, beneath the costume, you may find not an enemy, but a story, waiting to be retold. There is a mirror we carry inside us, though we rarely notice it. It is not made of glass or silver, but of thoughts, anticipations, and silent predictions about the world around us. This mirror does not simply reflect what is, but what we expect to see. And when we gaze through it, reality is no longer untouched. It bends, subtly and silently, to meet our expectations. Our brains do not process the world like cameras, taking snapshots of pure, unfiltered truth. Instead, they work like painters with trembling hands, layering each scene with colors we've mixed from past experiences, beliefs, and emotions. Before we even encounter something new, our minds have already prepared a brushstroke, a tone, a meaning. It's in this way that expectation becomes a lens that does not merely distort but constructs. A student walks into a classroom believing they are poor at math. The equations on the board feel more complex than they are. The teacher's explanations seem faster, the answers harder to grasp. The struggle confirms the belief, yet another student, expecting they'll understand, finds the same equations manageable, the pace steady, the challenge invigorating. The math hasn't changed, the mirror has. This is the mirror of expectation, and its illusions are so convincing that we rarely doubt them. When we believe someone is kind, we notice their smiles and overlook their silences. When we expect someone to be rude, their neutral words sound curt. Their pauses seem loaded. Expectation does not merely guide perception. It writes the script before the scene unfolds. Consider the placebo effect, where sugar pills heal and inert treatments soothe. The body responds not to the pill, but to the belief in the pill. The expectation of healing becomes its own form of medicine, reshaping biology with conviction alone. This is not magic. It is the mind's quiet ability to mold the world in the image of its own anticipation. Even in relationships, expectation whispers instructions. If we expect to be hurt, we brace ourselves, misread affection, distance ourselves before anyone else can, and then, alone again, we nod and say, "See, I knew this would happen." But perhaps it happened because we believed it would, because we shaped reality with the fear we held in our palms. Repetition strengthens the mirror. If you are told again and again that the world is dangerous, you begin to notice every shadow. If you are repeatedly reminded that you are not enough, you start to find evidence in every failure, no matter how small. The lie becomes familiar, and then familiar becomes true. What we expect we often create, not because the world conspires to agree with us, but because we unknowingly conspire with our own reflection. Expectations do not only live inside individuals, they float between us, forming shared illusions. Societies expect certain roles from men, from women, from strangers and friends. These roles are absorbed early and worn tightly like invisible clothes. We perform not for ourselves, but for the mirror held up by others. A child expected to be strong learns to hide their tears. One expected to be quiet learns not to speak. These reflections do not ask who we are. They tell us what we should be. And yet, the mirror is not unbreakable. Awareness is a chisel. If we learn to question the image we expect to see, we give ourselves a moment of truth, a glimpse beyond the frame. It begins with noticing the thoughts that arrive before the moment does. It grows with curiosity, not about what we see, but why we see it that way. Can we soften the image? Can we delay the judgment? Can we wonder, just for a breath, if we've been looking through tinted glass? The answer is not in abandoning expectations entirely, but in holding them loosely, in remembering that perception is not passive, it is participatory. We are not spectators in this life. We are painters, authors, co-creators of the meaning we draw from what we see. The mirror of expectation can imprison us, but it can also be turned into a window. When we expect kindness, we treat others gently. When we expect growth, we become resilient. When we expect possibility, doors we never noticed begin to appear. Expectation will always whisper in our ear, but we can choose which voice to amplify. And in doing so, we can change what is reflected back. Because the world doesn't just respond to our actions, it often responds to our anticipation of it. And the more we become aware of the mirror, the more we can choose to see, not what we fear, not what we assume, but what is actually there, waiting behind the glass. And in that quiet seeing, reality begins again. There is a strange comfort in the familiar, a sense of ease that arrives not through logic but through repetition, like a path we've walked so many times that our feet remember before our minds do. Familiarity, a quiet architect of belief, shaping the world not through force but through echo. This is the exposure effect, and it lives beneath the surface of how we know what we think we know. A face seen once is just a stranger. A face seen many times becomes a friend in the mind. A phrase, when heard for the first time, is greeted with skepticism. But heard again and again, it begins to feel correct. Not because it has been tested, not because it has earned truth, but because it is no longer foreign. The mind doesn't only hunger for accuracy, it hungers for fluency, for things that flow easily, things that don't trip the brain's sensors or require too much decoding. Repetition creates fluency, and fluency, it masquerades as truth. So the illusion begins. A repeated claim gains the warm patina of familiarity, and the brain, ever-conserving energy, labels it as safe, as trustworthy, as known, not because it is right, but because it is rehearsed. Advertisers know this, politicians know this, social media algorithms, designed not to find truth but to retain attention, know this best of all. The more a message is seen, the more believable it becomes. The more an image flashes by, the more likely we are to accept it as real. Even lies become velvet-lined when they echo long enough in the halls of our perception. This is the secret of the exposure effect, that what is repeated becomes rooted. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't knock on the door of critical thought. It seeps in through the windows of comfort. And once inside, it decorates the room of belief with curtains of certainty and familiar wallpaper that whispers, "You've seen this before. You can trust it." But what happens when this mechanism, so quiet, so automatic, is hijacked? When falsehoods become familiar, not by accident, but by design. When untruths are worn down into us like a stone in a river, shaped not by their merit, but by their presence. We begin to feel trust where it is not deserved. We begin to doubt that which is new, not because it is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. This is the cost of overexposure, the erosion of discernment. Think of how often the same phrases appear in headlines, how certain narratives are repeated, reshaped, reposted. Their repetition alone makes them harder to question. Like a song we didn't like the first time, but find ourselves humming days later, not because we changed our mind, but because our mind got used to the melody. And what of our personal lives, the beliefs we hold about ourselves, handed down by repeated comments, old stories, glances we misinterpreted but replayed in our heads? These too grow familiar, and what is familiar grows powerful. You are not smart. You always mess things up. You're just like your father. Heard once, they are painful. Heard often, they become prophecy. Not because they were ever true, but because they took up residence in the mind. They became the default. And the default is rarely questioned. But we must ask, how many of our deepest convictions are merely echoes? How many things we believe are simply things we've heard too many times to deny? The exposure effect teaches us to be cautious with repetition, to understand that our minds are not just storage for ideas, but fertile soil, and repeated seeds, even poisonous ones, will bloom. And so, we return to awareness, to the slow, gentle resistance of questioning what feels true simply because it has felt that way before. To notice when comfort is being used as a disguise, to recognize that what is familiar is not always what is real, because sometimes the truth is a whisper we've only just begun to hear, and sometimes the lie is simply louder. As the mind drifts further into sleep, let it soften around these reflections. Let it loosen its grip on the idea that belief is always born from clarity. Sometimes belief is born from repetition, and in that realization we begin to see the architecture of illusion, not with fear, but with curiosity, not to tear it all down, but to understand the walls we live within, and, perhaps, to find a door. We often rest under the comforting assumption that some sources are neutral, that certain voices simply report, without bending, without shaping, that news can be delivered without bias, without tint, like glass perfectly clear. Yet even this trust, quiet and rarely questioned, is itself a kind of illusion, the illusion of neutrality. In a world saturated with signals, we search for anchors, somewhere stable, somewhere trustworthy, somewhere to tell us what is real. We look for those who seem to stand outside the noise, above the chaos, holding a mirror to reality. But mirrors can curve, reflections can distort, and even the clearest lens must still choose where to focus. Every story told is a story shaped by decisions, what to include, what to omit, what tone to strike, what image to accompany the headline. The act of choosing is the act of framing, and framing, even unconsciously, steers perception. What we see becomes what we think, and what we think, over time, settles into what we believe. The illusion of neutrality thrives not because of overt manipulation, but because of subtle repetition. Repetition not of lies, but of angles, of patterns, of perspective. A particular rhythm of how things are explained, what gets emphasized, and what remains unsaid. When repeated often enough, it begins to feel like truth, not because it is questioned, but because it goes unquestioned. Imagine two people watching the same event through different windows. One window is wide, letting in color and movement and contrast. The other is narrow, casting the scene in shadows. Each believes they see the truth, but what they see is shaped by the frame, not false, not made up, just filtered. Objectivity, as we often understand it, is a noble pursuit. But even objectivity lives within context. Journalists are humans, editors are humans, institutions are made of humans, all bearing the weight of worldview, memory, emotion, pressure. And even when their goal is fairness, neutrality becomes a moving target. Because culture itself is not neutral. Language is not neutral. What is considered important, newsworthy, relevant, all of it emerges from invisible agreements shared within a society, and those agreements can be challenged, or they can be reinforced. Over time, that reinforcement begins to build shape. It becomes a structure of assumed truth, a scaffolding of credibility. And once a source is deemed credible, we lower our guard. We stop questioning. We absorb. And so illusion creeps in not through deception, but through repetition within trust. The more we see a source, the more we believe it to be impartial. The more it speaks in calm tones, wears the robe of professionalism, avoids overt extremes, the more it wears the mask of neutrality. And that mask, when unexamined, can be just as misleading as an open lie. This is not to say that all media is malicious, far from it. Many seek to inform with integrity. But even integrity swims in a sea of influence, a network of funding, of algorithms, of audience expectation. What gets the click? What holds attention? What keeps viewers returning? These pressures, silent and constant, nudge content toward familiarity, and familiarity breeds trust, and trust, repeated, turns into belief. The paradox of neutrality is that its most powerful illusion is not in what is said, but in what is believed about who is saying it. When we believe a voice is neutral, we often stop examining it. We accept, we integrate, and so the illusion becomes internal. We carry it with us, not realizing it was shaped, guided, designed, if not deliberately, then by structure, by habit, by unseen hands behind the curtain. This is why it matters to look beneath the surface, to notice not just what is being said, but how and why and by whom, to ask what is missing, what is repeated, what is presumed. These questions do not reject the media, they refine our relationship with it. They return us to the driver's seat of our own mind. In a world overflowing with narrative, to believe that some stories arrive untouched is to surrender our discernment. It is to let the repetition of calm voices build an architecture of belief without blueprint. But when we listen with awareness, when we recognize the illusion, we reawaken choice. We can step back, observe the pattern, and decide. Sleep does not come from clinging to clarity, but from releasing the need to control the image. In this space, where the light of screens dims and the mind softens, let us remember that truth is rarely static. It is dynamic, shaped by angles, context, framing, and most of all, by how we choose to see. So tonight, let the illusion of neutrality dissolve. Gently, let the calm voices speak, but not command. Let the headlines float past like distant boats. You are not required to board any of them. You are allowed to float above, to wonder, to question, to simply rest in the awareness that even clarity, when repeated, becomes a kind of fog. You awaken with the scent of something that never existed, a smile from a stranger you've never met, a betrayal that didn't happen. Yet your heart races, your pulse quickens, and a lingering feeling haunts the edges of your waking mind. The dream is gone, yet not gone. It spills over, staining the canvas of your day, and you begin to act on it, though you don't even know what it truly was. Dreams are echoes, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel, and sometimes they whisper so convincingly that our minds cannot tell them apart from memory. What is remembered isn't always what occurred. What is felt isn't always what was real. The line between sleep and waking is thinner than we admit, and in that quiet, in-between space, truth becomes soft clay, shaped by longing, emotion, suggestion. Dreams are not just the random firings of neurons. They are stories woven from your fears, your hopes, your history. They take fragments of memory and dress them in costumes of meaning. They combine the people you know with the places you've never been. They turn the impossible into the familiar and leave you believing that perhaps, just perhaps, you've lived something you never did. And here lies the danger, the comfort, too. Because the mind, in its quiet hunger for narrative, will absorb what dreams offer. It will fold them gently into the fabric of self. And when something is dreamt often enough, it becomes familiar. And when it is familiar enough, it feels true. The illusion of memory is not new. We've always been poor historians of our own minds. But the influence of dreams adds another layer, a surreal brush stroke across the already blurred lines of recollection. Have you ever woken from a dream of confrontation and, for the rest of the day, found yourself bristling towards someone you love, as though some unspoken crime had been committed in a world beyond reach, a world they never entered. But your mind did, and the emotional imprint it left was real, tangible. Emotions, after all, are the anchor of memory. We don't remember the sequence of events so much as we remember how we felt. And dreams speak directly in that language. They bypass logic. They carve their way into you, not with reason, but with resonance. A single night's dream can become a lifetime's grudge, or longing, or conviction. How many ancient stories, prophecies, revelations, how many wars, loves, and awakenings began not in fact, but in sleep? How often does the world bend around the contents of a single dream? And so the question begins to murmur in the quiet spaces of thought. If a lie is dreamt, and dreamt again, until the dreamer believes it, is it still a lie, or is it something else? A myth born in REM, a truth sculpted in sleep? The mind doesn't discriminate as much as we wish. It accepts what fits, what feels right, what the heart has room for. And if that room is filled with the echoes of dreams, soft voices that tell you who you are, who they are, what happened and what will happen, then the mind, eager for coherence, may let them stay. This is the haunting beauty of sleep. It doesn't just restore the body, it restores the narrative, but not always truthfully. False memories find their roots in repetition, suggestion, and dreaming, especially dreaming, because in dreams there is no contradiction. The mind accepts the unreal as real, and when we wake we often carry those fictions like fragile heirlooms. We don't question their origin, we simply feel their weight. Science has shown this, that dreams can alter memory, that imagined events, especially emotionally charged ones, can become indistinguishable from lived experience in the brain's filing system, that your trust in memory may be misplaced, that even your deepest convictions might have been born in the shadows of sleep. But science aside, you've known this already, you've felt it, in the quiet hour before sunrise, in the way a scent from a dream lingers like perfume on the soul, in the tears that come from a sadness you never actually lived, in the smile sparked by a love that never touched the earth. Dreams do not need reality to feel real, and we, as creatures of emotion, of story, of longing, we are built to believe in them. So as you drift tonight, remember this: not all that returns with you from sleep belongs to truth. Some things hitch a ride from the deep, curled in symbolism, wrapped in emotion, disguised as memory. But even knowing this, even with eyes open to the illusion, we still believe. Because sometimes belief is softer than truth, and the echo of a dream is more comforting than the silence of certainty. Let the dream pass through you. Let it sing, but don't let it settle. Feel its shape, then let it go. Not all that whispers in the night deserves a place in the light. Laughter has long been hailed as a balm for the soul, a universal language that connects us through joy, irony, and shared absurdity. But in the shadows of comedy, something more subtle often stirs, a shape draped in amusement that carries truths, twisted just enough to go unnoticed, a lie dressed in humor, hidden in the folds of a punchline, tiptoes past our defenses and settles quietly in the corners of our minds. The human brain is disarmed by laughter. When we laugh, we let our guard down. The analytical mind, which normally dissects and questions, softens under the rhythm of timing and wit. Our emotional circuits override our critical ones, allowing ideas to pass through us unchecked. This is why jokes can be powerful messengers, not just of levity, but of belief. In comedy, repetition is an ally. A joke told once is fleeting, but told again and again, on stages, in skits, in memes, becomes a familiar guest. And familiarity, as we've seen, breeds acceptance. So when falsehoods are embedded in jokes, they wear the cloak of entertainment, but carry the weight of suggestion. The idea becomes less alien, more tolerable, and eventually, possibly true. Consider how stereotypes are often introduced through jokes. The exaggeration invites a laugh, but beneath the surface a blueprint is laid. One joke becomes 2, then 5, then a recurring bit in a sitcom or a running gag in a viral video. The more it's heard, the more it's tolerated. The more it's tolerated, the more it begins to shape perception. Not because it's proven, but because it's been rehearsed. The mind is not merely entertained by the joke, it is trained by it. Over time, the line between satire and sincerity blurs. We begin to forget whether we first heard the idea in jest or in earnest. Was it a joke, or was it a comment wrapped in laughter? This confusion creates fertile soil for illusionary truth. Comedians, knowingly or not, become cultural cartographers. They sketch outlines of what is permissible to think, to say, to believe. In jest, they introduce taboos. They ridicule certain groups, endorse others. They frame events, political ideas, even history itself, in tones so entertaining that their narratives go unchallenged. And because the laughter felt real, the message lingers. Humor becomes the sugar coating and the bitter pill of misinformation. It allows ideas that would otherwise be rejected to be digested with ease. And the more these ideas are repeated under the banner of humor, the more plausible they feel. A falsehood repeated enough times becomes familiar, and the familiar feels true. The social nature of laughter compounds this effect. We rarely laugh alone. We laugh with others. In theaters, in living rooms, through shared clips on glowing screens. When others laugh, we are inclined to join in. And when we join in, we feel less inclined to question. The collective validation of a joke becomes a collective nod to the message beneath it. Group psychology makes the lie not only palatable but powerful. And then there's the fallback, the shield of irony. When challenged, the messenger can retreat. It was just a joke. The claim grants plausible deniability. The lie gets to linger without ever being owned. The harm is minimized in words but not in impact. The message remains, wrapped in a laugh, immune to scrutiny. But none of this is to demonize humor. On the contrary, laughter is a mirror of our deepest fears and desires. It exposes the hidden, surfaces the uncomfortable, and connects us in vulnerability. What matters is awareness, knowing that the joke is not always just a joke, that the cadence of comedy can carry ideas past our filters, that beneath the chuckle something may be shifting. Humor has the power to dismantle lies as much as it can smuggle them. It can challenge authority, puncture delusion, and unveil hypocrisy. It can liberate us from the grip of dogma and draw attention to injustice, but only if we are willing to listen beyond the laugh, only if we can laugh and still question. So the next time a joke strikes a chord, lingers in your thoughts, or echoes in repetition, pause. Ask what it smuggled in while your guard was down. Ask what belief it nudged forward under the guise of wit, not to extinguish the joy of laughter, but to honor its potency. Because even in play, words have power, and even behind the smile truth and falsehood dance. This is how illusion sometimes finds its easiest entry, through the doorway of delight. Quietly, humor can build bridges to beliefs we never meant to adopt. The joke lands, we laugh, and somewhere inside us a seed is planted. And like all seeds, it waits. There is a peculiar ache that arises when the mind meets contradiction, a ripple under the surface of belief, subtle but insistent, like an itch you can't reach. It's called dissonance, a tension not of sound but of thought, and when it grows it demands relief, not resolution. We are creatures of coherence, even if that coherence is illusory. The mind does not quietly sit with conflict. When two truths cannot coexist, something must be bent, erased, or replaced. But more often than not, what yields is not the lie, but reality. And so begins the architecture of denial. You believe yourself to be honest, kind, and rational. Then you support something that contradicts those values. Your hand signs the paper, your vote is cast, your silence joins a chorus you claim not to sing with. The contradiction is sharp, cutting through comfort. But instead of re-evaluating the action, the mind rewrites the belief. I did it for the greater good. It's not ideal, but it's necessary. They deserve it. They're wrong. I'm still good. And so the mind restores harmony, not by admitting the truth, but by painting over it. This is cognitive dissonance, a disquiet that forces the soul to contort itself into quieter shapes. It doesn't scream, it whispers with suggestion, and over time those whispers become beliefs. A person who lies often eventually comes to believe they are telling the truth, not because the facts changed, but because the discomfort of knowing otherwise is too great. To hold the lie while knowing it is a lie is to live in unbearable fracture. But if the lie is internalized, if it is dressed up in rationality and comforted with repetition, the fracture disappears. The mind becomes whole again, even if it is wrong. This is not weakness, this is wiring. The human brain is not optimized for truth, it is optimized for survival. Harmony within one's worldview is more useful than dissonance, especially in the tribe, in the family, in the collective mind. Belief is not built only on facts, but on what must be true for the self to remain intact. A parent tells their child something untrue out of fear. The child, trusting and small, absorbs it. Years later, they cling to that falsehood because abandoning it would mean their parent was wrong, or worse, untrustworthy. That's too dangerous a fracture. So the belief stays, reinforced not by data, but by emotional necessity. Dissonance shows up in small, invisible ways. A person loves animals but eats meat and turns away from the footage of farms. They claim it's different, necessary, humane. They love the environment but drive every day. They recycle and feel clean. The contradiction is swallowed in justification. The belief is reshaped to fit the behavior, not the other way around. And when this process occurs again and again, the original truth is forgotten. It doesn't disappear with a bang. It fades like a distant sound muffled under layers of soft excuses. Societies do this too. A government praises freedom while quietly surveilling its citizens. The people feel the conflict but are told it is for protection. They believe because disbelief is too destabilizing. The dissonance is resolved through trust, or fear, or silence. Even when the facts are undeniable, the pull of belief can overpower. A person sees evidence that counters their views and clings harder to what they already believe. Not because they are ignorant, but because they are human. Letting go of a long-held belief can feel like erasing a part of one's identity. So instead, the evidence is dismissed, the source discredited, the mirror turned away. Dissonance breeds denial, and denial breeds distortion. And once the false belief is anchored by enough emotion, enough repetition, and enough community, it becomes unshakable. The lie is no longer a stranger. It is home. There's something tragic in this. but also something deeply human. We all want to be whole. We all want to be right. We all want our inner world to match the outer one. And when they don't align, we bend the outside to fit the inside. The path to truth is not just a matter of information, it's a matter of courage. To sit with dissonance is to resist the urge to fix it with easy answers. To admit you were wrong is to fracture the self and then to rebuild it. Not everyone is ready for that, and some never are. But the alternative is a life lived in echo chambers, wrapped in soft illusions. Comfortable, yes, but brittle. The illusionary truth is not just about what is repeated. It's about what we refuse to confront, what we protect ourselves from. And the longer we live in denial, the deeper the lie roots itself until it feels indistinguishable from who we are. The dissonance is still there. It hums quietly beneath the surface, and maybe, just maybe, in moments of stillness, we hear it again. The invitation to realign, to revisit, to rethink, not to punish the self for past belief, but to honor the mind for evolving. Because the truth doesn't scream, it waits, it knocks quietly, and only those willing to feel the discomfort can hear it. It speaks with the cadence of your own thoughts, shaped with the intimacy of a whisper that has always been there. You might assume it's yours, the voice inside, the one that narrates your worries, your hopes, your doubts. It tells you what's acceptable, what's ridiculous, what's beautiful, what's wrong. But this narrator wasn't born with you. It was built. Slowly, layer by layer, word by word, repetition like gentle waves over stone carved its phrases into the folds of your mind. Until one day, the voice didn't sound like someone else. It sounded like you. But listen more closely. Where did it learn to say these things? The mind is not born empty, but it is born impressionable. Like a soft clay, it hardens not through intention but through exposure. The words we hear most often, especially when we're young, when our guards are down, or when our trust is high, slip past the barriers of reason and lodge themselves in the quietest corners. They echo back as instinct, but instinct can be taught. What you believe to be your truth may be the residue of 1,000 messages spoken with conviction by others. Society speaks in slogans, media repeats images, culture chants ideals. The loudest voices are often not those with the most reason, but those with the most reach, and over time what is loud becomes what is familiar. What is familiar becomes what feels safe, and what feels safe becomes what we believe. That is the haunting power of repetition. It doesn't argue, it doesn't debate, it doesn't need proof. It simply waits, softly knocking, whispering the same words through different mouths, until resistance wears thin and the message finds a home. What was once alien becomes obvious. What was once questioned becomes unquestionable. The voice in your head tells you not to speak up, that your ideas are silly, that your body should look different, that certain feelings must be hidden, that silence is strength, or that strength is control. But trace these phrases back. Ask, where did this begin? Who first said it and why? Whose interests are served by your quiet obedience? These voices, though internalized, are not internal by origin. They are echoes of parents repeating what was once told to them, teachers enforcing norms they never questioned, commercials designed to make you feel just inadequate enough to need what they're selling, systems speaking through slogans dressed up as self-worth. This isn't to say the voice is evil. It isn't even personal. It is simply the product of repetition and power. It is what happens when you hear the same message so many times from so many sources that your brain mistakes it for truth. And because it arrives with familiarity, we do not interrogate it, we absorb it. Then we embody it. But here's the quiet revolution. The voice in your head can be rewritten, not erased, not silenced, but softened, questioned, countered. Because the same mechanism that once programmed your beliefs, repetition, emotional resonance, authority, can also unweave them. The key is awareness, to sit with your thoughts not as facts, but as possibilities. To ask, is this really mine? Do I believe this because it aligns with my values, or because I've heard it so many times I've stopped asking? The illusion is that we are the authors of our inner world, but in truth much of it was ghost-written. And now it is our task, slowly, gently, to edit the script, to find which lines still resonate, to discard what no longer serves, and to write new ones that reflect not the loudest voices around us, but the quiet truths within us. This chapter is not about blame. It is about noticing. It is about reclaiming the inner monologue that has too long been mistaken for identity. For when you begin to hear the voice, not as your own, but as something shaped by your surroundings, you create a space between thought and belief. And in that space, something beautiful happens. You begin to choose, not just what to think, but who you are. And in that choice, your real voice begins to rise, not the inherited one, but the one that has waited patiently behind the noise. We often long for the past, not as it was, but as we remember it. And what we remember is rarely truth. Nostalgia doesn't call us back to reality. It constructs a softened echo of what once was, glazed with familiarity and bathed in warmth. Like watching a flickering film reel that skips over pain and lingers too long on laughter. And as the reel loops, again and again, what was once merely a moment becomes a myth, a distorted clarity that comforts even as it blinds. Repetition is the architect of nostalgia. Each retelling of a childhood memory, each song played from an older time, each revisited photograph silently chisels away the edges of the original experience, not to sharpen them, but to round them off into something easier to hold, easier to miss. In the stories we tell ourselves and others, the past becomes less about detail and more about emotion, less about what happened and more about how we wish it had. And so, repetition polishes the mundane until it gleams like gold. A walk to school becomes a ritual of innocence. A cramped house becomes a sanctuary. Even the silence of loneliness is transfigured into peace. But this isn't a lie we consciously tell. It's a lie that slowly seeps into our marrow, whispering that things were better, simpler, truer back then. That if only we could go back, we would find ourselves again. But we forget that we were searching even then. Our minds are efficient storytellers. They prefer harmony over accuracy. The conflicting fragments of the past, the uncertainties, the failures, the awkwardness, are too jagged to carry. So repetition smooths them down. The more we remember, the less accurate our memories become. Not because we forget, but because we reframe. Each recollection is a rewriting, each nostalgic sigh a quiet revision of history. Nostalgia makes us feel whole by blurring the truth. It offers a refuge, but it's one built on echoes. And when we enter that sanctuary too often, we begin to compare the present, messy, uncertain, alive, to a past that never truly existed. The now can never compete with the curated then, and in doing so, we rob the present of its texture, its authenticity. We begin to distrust the moment we're in, measuring it against an illusion we've crafted ourselves. The repetition of old narratives has another side effect. It creates a cultural nostalgia, one that's larger than the individual. A society can trap itself in a loop, idolizing a golden age that was never golden for everyone, clinging to aesthetics, rituals, and ideologies not because they serve the present, but because they've been repeated enough to feel safe. The past becomes a product, endlessly marketed and mythologized until people believe that going backward is the only way forward. But memory is not a mirror, it's a canvas, and nostalgia is not color correction, it is a filter. When we romanticize the past, we also falsify it. The repetition of selective memory becomes a form of silent propaganda, one we spread to ourselves, our children, and those around us. It's not malicious, it's natural, it's human. But it is not always harmless, because the more we retreat into idealized memories, the more we abandon the work of building meaning now. We forget that the past only feels sacred because we survived it, and in surviving we shaped it. Not all of it was good, not all of it was pure, but it all brought us here, and here deserves our attention. To see the past clearly requires courage, to hold both the joy and the jaggedness without letting either erase the other, to allow our memories to breathe, not to freeze into statues of worship. Nostalgia's trap is not the memory itself, but the belief that it is flawless, that it was better because it came first. But even now, the present is becoming memory, the words you're hearing, the thoughts you're forming, this very breath. One day it too will be reshaped by the quiet hand of repetition. So, if we are to remember, let us remember honestly. Let us carry forward not just the beauty of what was, but the fullness of what truly happened. For only then can we honor the past without becoming trapped by it. Only then can we embrace nostalgia not as a refuge, but as a reminder that every moment, even the one you're in now, holds the seeds of sacredness. If we allow it to be real, if we let it be whole. The room seems empty, yet everything in it pulls at you. A softly glowing button shaped to catch your eye. A gentle ping, carefully tuned to your nervous system. The words it displays, the colors it chooses, even the timing of the next suggestion. All of it seems incidental, but none of it is. We live in systems that are designed, and those designs have intentions. They guide not just what we do, but what we believe. This is the architecture of persuasion, and often of illusion. Deception, in its rawest form, is rarely subtle, but when woven into the fabric of our digital and social environments, it becomes something else, ambient, almost invisible. The edges blur. What seems like free choice begins to feel more like a pre-written script. It starts small. You scroll, you tap, you engage. But the things you see next are not random. They are curated, selected not only by algorithms, but by the subtle nudges baked into every layer of the experience. A world arranged not to show you truth, but to keep you inside of it. Design at its best can be beautiful, but when its purpose is manipulation, beauty becomes bait. The softness of a font, the calming of a pastel hue, the familiar rhythm of a scroll. These aren't just aesthetics, they're psychological levers. Behavioral engineers know that we are not creatures of logic, but of patterns. Give us something easy to believe, something pleasant to hold, and something repetitive enough to feel true, and we rarely question it. The tragedy is not that we're fooled. The tragedy is that we believe we aren't, that we think we're above it, that we imagine ourselves immune to the design of belief. But what if our opinions are the residue of design? What if the truths we cling to are not born of reflection, but of repetition wrapped in convenience? A user interface can tilt perception. Headlines can be written to appear neutral while seeding doubt. Menus can highlight certain options over others. Metrics, likes, shares, views become surrogates for truth, not because we choose them, but because we're trained to. Slowly, the illusion forms. If many believe it, it must be so. This is deception by design, not lies told loudly, but realities constructed softly. Not an argument shouted at your doorstep, but a trail of breadcrumbs that leads you quietly away from your own thoughts and into theirs. The control is not in what you see, it's in what you never thought to ask for. The story you didn't know you were missing, the questions that weren't suggested, the possibilities that were never offered as options. We were told we live in an age of information, but more often it is an age of suggestion, infinite choices but guided pathways, apparent freedom but invisible scaffolding. And inside that maze of mirrors, we begin to lose track of what is ours. What do I really believe? What have I merely clicked on too many times? What idea returned so often that it no longer felt foreign? Systems don't need to lie. They just need to favor the convenient, the pleasing, the profitable. And as they do, they shape belief, not through confrontation, but through exposure. They don't fight our doubts. They drown them in familiarity. They tell us what we already half believe, and then tell us again, and again, and again. Design makes it easy, frictionless, seamless. You don't need to think deeply if the next belief loads instantly. You don't need to reflect if the story comes with music, subtitles, a rhythm your brain can dance to. You don't need to search because it finds you. The great trick is this. It feels like truth, but it isn't truth. It's smoothness, it's resonance, it's repetition, and above all, it's intent. Designed spaces reflect the motives of their makers, and when belief is formed inside of those spaces, it is always at risk of being borrowed, not discovered. But within this realization lies a quiet kind of power. To notice, to pause before accepting, to see the architecture before moving through the hall. Because once you see the design, you begin to see the intention. And once you see the intention, you remember your agency. You are not immune, but you are not powerless. The illusions we're nudged toward are strongest when we move without question. But if we learn to see the hands beneath the curtain, the strings behind the motion, the echo in the voice, we begin to reclaim something. Not perfect clarity, not absolute truth, but space. Space to think, to doubt, to decide. Because even in a world built to deceive, awareness is resistance, and every moment of attention we give freely, rather than being guided, is a small act of reclamation. And sometimes that is where truth begins again, quietly, slowly, in the space design forgot to claim. It begins as a whisper, a phrase repeated to motivate, a mantra softly spoken in solitude, an affirmation taped to the bathroom mirror, traced by the fingertips of someone longing for change. It feels harmless, empowering even. But repetition is never neutral. It carves pathways, wears grooves, and soon what began as a conscious thought becomes the architecture of self. You do not notice when it starts to settle in your bones. When the sentence once said with hesitation begins to feel like home. I am enough. I am strong. I am broken. I don't belong. Whether glowing with light or steeped in shadow, repeated words bind themselves to identity. They become the rhythm of breath, the pulse behind action. Every time you say it, you strengthen it, not just in your memory, but in your very way of being. The mind is remarkably efficient. It conserves energy by favoring familiar roots, repeating not only patterns of behavior but also patterns of thought. It seeks consistency, craves predictability, and will echo what it hears the most, regardless of truth. So it begins to chant, even in silence. You hear it in the pauses between conversation, in the stillness before sleep. The phrase you adopted, whether joy or judgment, becomes your narrator. And over time you forget that it was once optional, a choice. This is the quiet transformation. You are no longer just the speaker of the mantra. You are the mantra. Your belief system bends around the words you've rehearsed. A slogan becomes your lens. A phrase becomes your prism. And with enough repetition, you begin to embody it, move from thinking the thought to being the thought. This phenomenon is not confined to personal development or whispered self-help. It seeps into culture, into politics, into advertising. Just do it. Because you're worth it. Make America great again. These are not just catchphrases. They are psychic imprints, looping in the background of collective consciousness, subtly instructing behavior and anchoring identity to ideology. And we absorb them, often without question. Their repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity feels safe. When an idea is repeated often enough, it bypasses scrutiny. The brain stops evaluating it on merit and simply accepts it as known, as normal. The absurd becomes plausible, the fabricated becomes familiar, and the familiar becomes real. This is the quiet power of repetition, not just in shaping what we think, but in shaping who we are. A person who repeats, "I always mess things up," becomes someone who sabotages their own success. A child told they're a troublemaker begins to fulfill that prophecy. A population bombarded with divisive slogans begins to fracture along the very lines drawn by repetition. But this truth cuts both ways. It is also the secret path to transformation. For if the self can be etched by repeated negativity, it can also be rewritten through conscious, intentional refrains. The voice in the mirror can change. The loops can shift. The story can be retold, one phrase at a time. Still, this is no simple magic. It requires awareness. To step back and ask, whose words are these? Who gave me this script? Do I even believe this, or have I just said it too many times to know the difference? In asking, we peel back the layers of adopted identity and confront the raw clay of who we might become. There is a paradox at the heart of this transformation. We must use repetition to transcend repetition. We must engage the same tool that shaped the illusion to carve out a deeper truth. But this time, we do it with eyes open, with hands steady. We choose our phrases like seeds, aware that they will root in the soil of our minds and bloom into the posture of our lives. And we must remember that even silence has its own repetition. A word not said is also a loop. A fear not confronted is its own chant. So the question isn't whether we are being shaped by repetition, but which repetitions we allow to shape us. In the end, we become the phrases we echo. Not instantly, but gradually, not with fireworks, but with footsteps, one repeated sentence at a time. And if we are not careful, we wake up not knowing whether the voice we hear is ours or merely the loudest one that never stopped repeating. So we must listen, gently, deliberately, and perhaps for the first time choose a different phrase to repeat. One that doesn't shrink us but expands us, one that doesn't cage us but frees us. A phrase not of illusion, but of awakening. Because in the still quiet of repetition lies a doorway, and what we choose to say through it will shape the very contours of who we are. There comes a quiet moment when the echo begins to fade, when the once hypnotic rhythm of repetition starts to feel offbeat, even if only by a fraction. It is not a scream or a revelation. It is a gentle drift, like waking up not with a jolt but by noticing the air has changed. Escaping the illusion is not a single act of resistance. It is not a heroic leap out of darkness into clarity. It is the slow unpeeling of what you thought was skin but was, all along, a layered costume of other people's phrases, inherited beliefs, and unnoticed nudges. It is noticing that the voice in your mind does not always sound like your own, that what feels like conviction might in fact be residue. To see through illusionary truths, one must first entertain the idea that they exist, and this is not easy. It requires the surrender of certainty, the abandonment of comfort. Because illusions are not always harmful, some are soothing, some are beautiful, some cradle us in a narrative that makes the world feel coherent, even if it is not. But the first step is always noticing the repetition, the headlines that repeat not because they inform, but because they shape, the slogans that feel like memories, the phrases you say without remembering when you first heard them. Repetition is a tool, and like all tools, it can construct or confine. The second step is interruption, to pause before acceptance, to ask the question, where did this idea come from? Not as a form of cynicism, but as a practice of clarity. Most of the time, we do not think. We echo. We replay. We perform the internal scripts given to us by culture, family, tribe, or trend. Escaping illusion is interrupting that performance, rewriting the line, asking whether this belief is a conclusion you arrived at or one you were handed. But even awareness is not enough, because knowledge can coexist with illusion. The human mind has a remarkable ability to hold contradiction without collapse. We can know something is a fabrication and still feel it as true. This is why the third step is emotional honesty, to explore not only what we believe, but why it comforts us, to admit that some illusions are kept alive not because we are fooled, but because we are afraid that without them we'll float unanchored, afraid that reality, stripped of its narrative costume, might feel cold, disjointed, or meaningless. And so, to escape illusion is also to grieve it, to mourn the neatness it once offered, to walk through the discomfort of truth without reaching prematurely for another comforting lie. In this journey, solitude can be sanctuary. The noise of consensus is loud, but silence can reveal what the chorus conceals. In quiet moments, unplugged from persuasion, far from curated consensus, we can feel the faint pulse of our original thoughts. They are rarely loud. They do not wear hashtags, but they are ours, and in their subtlety lies their strength. The next step is dialogue, not to be affirmed, but to be challenged. Escaping illusion does not mean retreating into suspicion or constructing a new fortress of absolute certainty. It means engaging with others not to win, but to refine, to let friction sharpen thought, to listen not for the purpose of agreeing, but for the purpose of expanding. In dialogue, we discover not just what others believe, but how belief forms. And then, finally, there is practice, because the mind, left unattended, drifts toward the familiar. Even after awakening, illusion whispers. Repetition still works. The seduction of simplicity does not vanish with awareness. It requires daily rituals of questioning, regular audits of belief, compassionate suspicion of certainty. It is a practice, like mindfulness, like humility, like sleep. Escaping illusion is not an act of disconnection from the world. It is a deeper connection to it. A willingness to see the patterns, the games, the scripts, not to disengage, but to engage more consciously, to choose what you believe, to recognize when you are being persuaded, to feel the edge where narrative ends and awareness begins. You will never silence the noise, but you can learn to hear beneath it. You can begin to distinguish your voice from the voice of the crowd. You can find, buried beneath the repeated phrase, a question that was never answered. And in the asking of that question, you begin the slow and sacred work of escaping the illusion, not to live without stories, but to live in stories you've chosen, not to reject belief, but to believe with your eyes open, and not to silence repetition, but to hear it for what it is, a rhythm that can hypnotize, or a rhythm that can awaken. And as you lay still, eyes closed, hearing the hum of the world shaping itself, remember this. The first illusion to escape is the belief that you cannot. There is a rare kind of clarity that only arrives in silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence that breathes between distractions. In that space, quiet, slow, and vast, we begin to hear things we never noticed. Not voices, not words, but tremors beneath the noise, signals long drowned by repetition, habits, and the pull of the familiar. In stillness, illusions do not vanish, but they begin to shift, their threads unwinding just enough to reveal the seams. Stillness is not escape. It is confrontation. It strips away motion, which so often serves as camouflage. In the rush of tasks, the blur of headlines, the hum of ambient entertainment, we rarely question what we accept. It's easier that way. We move from one moment to the next, letting repetition fill in the blanks. But when we stop, truly stop, something strange happens. The stories we tell ourselves begin to echo, and some of them don't sound like us anymore. The power of stillness lies in what it exposes. A belief we've repeated 1,000 times suddenly feels foreign. A phrase we took for truth trembles under scrutiny. Without the distraction of momentum, we are left face to face with the architecture of our own assumptions. The walls of our minds that we thought were built from reason are revealed, brick by brick, to be held together with old memories, borrowed thoughts, and unexamined emotions. In a world built on speed, stillness becomes a rebellion. It refuses the cycle, it halts the loop, and in doing so, it invites awareness, not the kind that comes from information, but the kind that rises from attention. Attention without agenda. Attention that watches the breath not because it's interesting, but because it's there. Attention that lets the moment be unadorned, without demand. In that space, the mind's rehearsed narratives begin to loosen their grip, and what remains is not always comfortable, but it is always real. We are creatures of momentum, but we are also creatures of reflection. Somewhere deep beneath the noise, there is a self that does not speak in slogans. It does not chant the chorus of consensus. It does not follow for comfort. That self waits in stillness, buried under the layers of repetition, coated in the residue of 1,000 echoed phrases. But it is patient. It listens. And when the outer noise fades, it rises, not with drama, but with a whisper that sounds like remembering. Stillness disrupts not by attacking illusion, but by refusing to feed it. It does not argue with the lie. It simply stops repeating it. In the quiet, the loop collapses. The need to perform, to prove, to defend fades. The lie withers from neglect. Not because it was defeated, but because it was ignored long enough to lose its shape. It is in these moments that clarity begins, softly, slowly, not as a lightning strike, but as a fog that lifts. And with it we see the world not as it was told to us, but as it simply is, imperfect, beautiful, uncertain. We see others not as categories, but as mysteries. We see ourselves not as the echo of every voice we've ever heard, but as a question worth sitting with. Stillness does not provide answers. It invites better questions. It does not fix what is broken. It reveals what was hidden. It does not pretend the world is simple. It acknowledges its depth, and that, perhaps, is where healing begins, not with solutions, but with space. A pause in the spiral, a breath between beliefs, a crack in the mirror of repetition. And in that space, something ancient moves. Not a thought, not a truth, but a presence. Waiting, quietly, listening. You. In the final stretch of silence, where echoes have softened and the mind rests like dust settling on old pages, there is no grand arrival, no trumpet of revelation. The truth enters differently, not as a hammer, not as a flare, but as a visitor, gentle, almost unnoticed. It doesn't knock, it doesn't force its way through locked mental doors. It arrives like mist through an open window, only noticed when the skin begins to feel it, when the breath slows and the air becomes still. You've spent hours traveling through the corridors of illusion, stepping over the wires of repetition and brushing past curtains woven with half-remembered words. Each hallway echoed with fragments that once felt real, once sounded like your own thoughts. But now the echoes have faded. What remains is a kind of spaciousness, a quiet not of absence but of possibility. This is where truth lives, not in confrontation, but in subtlety. It rarely arrives fully formed. It comes as a question, a feeling of friction when something rehearsed no longer fits, a quiet discomfort with the familiar, or a sudden hush in the presence of something that asks for stillness. That's where it hides, not in the proclamations shouted by crowds, but in the spaces where crowds fall silent, in the glance that lingers too long, in the pause before you answer, in the soft resistance you feel inside when a borrowed belief no longer feels like home. Truth, in its purest form, doesn't beg to be accepted. It doesn't argue or defend. It waits, patiently. It watches as our minds chase certainty, run toward comfort, defend the stories we've been told and tell ourselves. And then, without demand, it sits down beside us. It offers no condemnation for the illusions we've clung to. It understands. It knows that the mind is built for pattern, for simplicity, for safety. And sometimes those things come easier through the illusions than through truth. But eventually truth whispers. And in that whisper is a peculiar kind of gravity. Not loud but undeniable. It doesn't override your thoughts. It harmonizes with something older than language. It nudges rather than shoves. And if you listen, truly listen, not with the ears but with the quiet space behind your thinking, you'll feel it resonate, not as something external, but as something returning, something remembered. We spend so much time looking outward for what is true, seeking consensus, authority, repetition, validation. But truth rarely resides in what is loudest or most shared. It lives in the soft tug inside when you hear something and it just doesn't sit right, or when you've believed something for years, and then one day, for no particular reason, it begins to dissolve. Not with panic, but with relief. That's the strange kindness of truth. It doesn't rip things away. It helps you release them. You don't have to fight for it. You have to get quiet enough to feel where it's already been waiting. It often doesn't give you answers, but it always invites you to ask better questions. And when it finally rests beside you, it doesn't need to prove itself. It feels like a homecoming, like returning to a voice you didn't know you'd forgotten. And even if it doesn't change everything at once, It changes the way you see everything. You begin to notice the noise for what it is. Noise. You begin to feel the weight of words that never belonged to you. You begin to make room, not to replace illusions with other illusions, but to simply hold the space for what might actually be. Truth teaches you to be less sure, not more, and somehow that uncertainty feels more stable than anything you shouted with confidence. So in this final chapter, there is no resolution, no neat conclusion, just a breath, a pause, a quiet hand placed on your shoulder in a dark room. No promise that everything you believe is wrong. No declaration that you must now change. Just a subtle shift, like the moment you turn your head and realize the sun has risen, not because of an alarm, but because the light simply arrived. Let it be that simple. Let it be that soft. Let the truth come not to tear down, but to reveal gently. Let it walk with you, not as a judge, but as a companion. One that doesn't shout directions, but walks quietly, always a step behind, until you're ready to notice. And maybe now you are. Sleep now, with fewer weights and a little more space, not filled with answers, but emptied of noise. Let the visitor sit beside you in silence, and in that silence, may you remember what was always yours, what was always true,